like to begin by passing on to the chairman for this first session, Mr. Wolfgang Suske. Wolfgang is a great friend and colleague, and he is one of the founders of the result-based payment network in the EU, which has put a huge amount of voluntary input into. So, Wolfgang, over to you.
Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome from sunny Vienna. Not in lockdown until now. Very short, I'm coordinating in Austria the result-based scheme, and I'm lecturing in University of Life Resources. And with me is Johanna Huber, who I will introduce a bit later. Result-based schemes for these participants who are new under us. An approach where we pay not actions or permissions like reduction of fertilization or mowing dates. There we pay for results. So, for example, for species or for habitats for structures. This is the big difference of this new, very interesting approach. Several projects were started also by the European Parliament in a big pilot in the last years with Ireland, United Kingdom, Romania, and Spain, and then several countries followed or already started. Some of them, like Austria, have started a pilot project. Some of them, like Germany or France, has already implemented this scheme in their rural development program. So the main task today is implementation of result-based payments in the future of the CAP. Maybe for many countries who didn't already think on that, a very interesting session. There is a need of exchange and a need of exchange experiences and knowledge. And so therefore several countries developed a network last year. This is a big but small network, big because many countries are participating, small because we have no resources, but we will do our best, and many countries are really contributing and helping us to fill in this network with information of their countries, with examples, with stories of the farmers. So a great thank you to everybody who is already participating, and a big invitation who is not participating after this session to participate. And I want to hand over to my colleague, Johanna Huber, who is more or less leading all this stuff with the website and with questions and answers. And she will tell you shortly what happened already and what will happen in the future.
Yes, hello everybody from my side. I'm very happy that our results-based payment network organizes this webinar today in conjunction with Burren Winterage School. And yes, very happy that so many people are joining us here today. And as Wolfgang said, I would like to say a few words, just few words to our result-based payment network. And so our first network meeting was last year in September. We had a big conference in Vienna where 50 participants came together, and we also visited some farms for farmers who are participating in the Austrian result-based scheme. And this was the starting point of the result-based payment network. So the next step we decided on was to build a website, because we would like to form a platform where all the information comes together concerning result-based payment schemes. And the main part of this website is to show what is happening in the different countries of the EU concerning result-based payment schemes. So we have these country profiles. I think now you can see on your screen like a screenshot of our website and also the address. So please visit it. And yeah, as I said, we have on the right side, you see the flags, the country flags, and there we try to sum up all the information from these countries concerning result-based payment projects or schemes. And for this task, we are very happy to have so-called country profile managers from every country, one person who is in charge of this task, providing us the information for the website. And yeah, we are also presenting upcoming events or current literature or some collection of challenges and tips concerning result-based payment schemes on the website. You can find it on the up part under the different buttons. Yes, and I would like to invite you, if you have any information, if you have dates or questions concerning result-based payment schemes, then please contact us and we will put it either on the website or try to answer your question. What else do? We have webinars. We already had one webinar in June. The topic was assessment of result-based indicators. And yeah, if you are interested, you can find a recording on the website of this webinar. Of course, we would like to organize also real life events. This year, this wasn't possible, but we are quite optimistic that we can do this next year and that we can visit maybe Lithuania or Latvia and meet up. Yeah, and of course we will continue with the webinars, so there will come up some more. And if you have topics you are interested in, then please let us know. Yes, I think we are at a really interesting stadium of the CAP right now. Many countries are developing result-based payment schemes, or at least starting pilot projects. And our network is very happy to offer any help that we can. So please don't be shy to come up to us, and we will try to connect all responsible people. Thank you. Have a nice webinar.
So, thank you very much, Johanna, for this short introduction and invitation to our network, and I hand over to Brendan.
Thanks, Wolfgang and Johanna. So we have, as I said, a really exciting program planned this afternoon. These result-based payment schemes, as Wolfgang and Johanna have said, are becoming very topical and an area of great interest. So we have a large group of attendees today. And because we have so much to share, we decided to split it into two sessions. So right now, we're going to divide the webinar into two groups. One group who are in parallel session one, looking at some really interesting case studies from the United States, from Ireland, and from across Europe, will stay in this room and listen to those presentations. And for the remainder of the group who are moving to parallel session two, if you could please, those who are interested in the implementation of RBPS in the CAP Green Architecture session chaired by Wolfgang, you're going to leave this room and join another meeting. My colleague Tim, if you go to the chat box, my colleague Tim will direct you on how to join the other meeting. So that's for room 2. You're going to leave this meeting and join another meeting for an hour before you return. Tim?
Hi folks, so I'm just waiting on Donald, who's our host in the second room, to post a link. And those of you who are interested in joining the parallel session, you'll see a box saying, asking if you'd like to leave. And we'll return here for the plenary session after an hour. So Donald, if you could post that link, please. There we go. So in the chat box, folks, if you can't open it, it's on the right-hand side. And those of you who wish to go to the parallel session on the implementation of the RBPS and the CAP Green Architecture, please click that link now, and we'll see you back here for the plenary session in an hour. If you have any questions or issues, you can chat to me directly, and I'll try and help you out. The chat function should be open now. So we'll just give you 5 minutes to make that change. I can see some people are leaving already and changing over to the other meeting. That's great. Okay, so those who are staying, I guess, are staying. So I can
maybe say a few words about this current session. I'll chair this session. We have three fantastic speakers, and I better get started because they've got very little time to share their stories. I'm particularly delighted to welcome all the way from the United States, Timothy Mail. We connected with Timothy last year during some seminars and RBAPs that were being held in Brussels. And it was really interesting chatting to Tim at the time about the pay for success schemes that they were considering developing in the States. So I'm delighted to welcome Timothy Mail to the floor today. Timothy's from the Policy Innovation Organization in the United States. Timothy, over to you.
Great, thanks so much, and thank you all for joining today. Just a little bit of background, and I'll pull up my slides as I'm talking. So I'm the executive director of a nonprofit called the Environmental Policy Innovation Center, and our focus is really just on faster approaches to produce environmental outcomes. So we work on toxic lead pipe replacement in drinking water systems, and we work on things like results-based payment or pay for success schemes in the United States, and a diversity of other things like endangered species policy. I am a biologist by training, have worked at nonprofits for about 20 years, but in the middle of that 20 years, I went and worked at the White House Council on Environmental Quality for 3 years in the Obama administration, and just became fascinated by this kind of work and this way to deliver you know, better results. I just want to make sure, can you all see my full screen right now?
Yes, we can. Timothy, yeah,
Great.
You're not sharing your screen yet, though.
Oh, I'm not. Okay. Okay, give me a second. Let's try this.
Yeah.
Screen sharing. Great, and that's full screen?
Yeah.
Or no notes? Okay.
We're seeing your next slide as well there.
Oh, yeah, okay. 1 second. How about now?
Yeah, perfect.
There we go. Great. That's a wetland. But I have to start with what is the oldest space for results-based programs in the United States, which is wetland mitigation banking. It's a program that's been in place for about 30 to 40 years under one of our federal laws called the Clean Water Act. But really, it took a new form in terms of being results-based, focused on ecological outcomes, starting in around 2008. The market for restored wetlands in the United States today is about $4.8 billion a year. So this is primarily government agencies and private companies who are impacting wetlands being legally permitted to impact those wetlands, but paying for typically more acreage or more hectares of restored wetlands somewhere else. Over the history of this program, it's about 400,000 hectares of wetlands that have been restored. Often those wetlands are located, you know, much more strategically near other pieces of protected land or contiguous habitat, as opposed to fragments in, you know, more urban or more developed settings. And this field really started in a nonprofit space and has become very much of an industry, a professional restoration industry. The standards for restoration, and I'll show a picture of a site now. This is not a wetland, this is a stream restoration, but the standards are focused on hydrological, geomorphic, and biological criteria that determine whether the entity that performs the restoration is going to get paid. So this is an example of a stream restoration. I live near Washington, D.C. and not too far from Washington, D.C., where you have a highly eroded stream on a farm, on a working farm, and a company comes in, puts in place a design, does the restoration, still without any payment, and then completes the restoration. After completion of the restoration and achievement of some performance metrics, is allowed to sell some of the value of that restoration, and then the work goes on from there, and the payments can go on from there. I'll just digress for a moment and say that I think there's a lot of terminological differences between here and in most of your countries, and I'll try to avoid terminology as much as possible. There's also, as I'm sure you all discuss from time to time, a gray space between outputs like construction completed and outcomes like healthy wildlife populations or, you know, thriving meadows or streams. And we have that same tension in the United States as well, trying to find outcomes that are close enough to the time of project being completed that it's valuable to a farmer or a rancher or a company, but far enough away from construction that it's likely to lead to ecological success. The biggest market, as I mentioned, is in wetlands, now streams. Streams, the last slide I showed was a newer market. Our endangered species results-based schemes have struggled more, have struggled to define what a successful outcome looks like. And this is a species called the bog turtle, a little baby one in my hands, that live mostly on farm-based wetlands. So very high sun, high light environments, typically on the edge of farms in the northeastern United States, and are a perfect example of the kind of species that probably can only be helped by farmers and agriculture, and where there's a lot of development in places like the Northeast, one of our largest areas of population. We've really struggled in this space to figure out what the ecological outcomes are that would trigger, approval of a project and payment. A lot of the work that I do is actually focused on price, because when we talk to government agencies, what they care about is whether there's a good way to get the outcome. So I have on here the wholesale price of cocaine in the United States, not from personal experience, and looking at restoration costs. And what you see on the top two, the blue bars at the top of this slide, are two examples of sort of the traditional ways for local government to procure water outcomes in the United States. And it's very much of an iterative, broken up contracting process. And what has started happening, in particular in the region that I live in the country, but also in some other areas that I will show you on the next slide, excuse me, is that local government's starting to look at these results-based payment schemes or contracts as a way to deliver projects. And what they're finding is that when you have, one party that's responsible for everything from finding the site, again, typically on farms or working forests, planning that site, but identifying the design, delivering the design, carrying out construction, doing post-construction monitoring, post-construction adaptive management, that all that turns out to be dramatically cheaper than their previous ways of doing it. So these are all real dollar numbers from local government experience in the last 5 to 7 years in the region of America where I live. And there are some cost estimates that are way beyond the right-hand side of this chart. And then there are some newer farm-based approaches that are way less expensive. And there's a varying degree of focus on real outcomes in some of these contracts. All of it, as I expect, is true for many of you, is a work in progress in getting people to shift from construction completed or paying for activities toward real performance. But typically these projects have, again, there's a water quality, there's a flow component, there's a design component, there's an invasive species component, and there's some sort of diversity component around the plant composition. And usually most of them have a tree survival component as well for vegetation that is planted on these sites. These kinds of projects are all driven by a regulatory scheme in the United States, again, under the Clean Water Act, something that's evolved really just in the last 20 years, that's requiring more and more areas in the country to improve the quality of natural water systems in the United States. As I mentioned, the pay for success or results-based schemes are expanding across the United States. The numbers on this slide are less important. Again, this was the slide I put together for a local government office, so I was trying to focus on the cost savings associated with these approaches. But in places like California, you have 1,000 hectare, 2,000 hectare restorations going on of coastal wetlands habitats. Similar kind of work happening in Louisiana, again tied to biological and physical components of restored wetlands. In states like in the Midwest and Iowa and Wisconsin, these are very much in what we call row crop agriculture, so corn, wheat, soybean kind of agriculture settings, where there's very extensive crop production, and it's really focused on the sort of marginal habitats, pollinator habitats, streamside, riparian zones, and wetland areas where you can create some kind of water quality benefit. In the United States, we've converted the outcomes we care about in all sorts of ways that vary by state, and it's a confusing morass of currencies really for anyone trying to figure out what is it that I'm supposed to produce to be paid. But it's evolving. It's evolving, and there's more and more ability to translate almost with a Rosetta Stone from one state to another, what's being paid for, what are the outcomes, what are the standards. Just to jump more specifically into some of the contracting approaches that we are focused on in a pay for success arrangement, this is the sort of schematic way that we think about it. So typically farmers are not doing this at their own expense at the beginning. Someone else is paying them at least part of what it costs to take on various activities. And in the United States, that's increasingly either a local government entity or it's a private investment source. So it could be a nonprofit like ours, but more often it's big investors. So there are now 10 and 20 and $50 million investor-driven funds, so for-profit funds paying farmers to adopt activities, which then go through a process of the activities and the outcomes being put into models to produce, to document what's happening, post implementation monitoring to confirm what was anticipated to happen has happened. Those outcomes being certified, again, usually by a government or university, a third party, and then those outcomes being fit back into either corporate ESG, environment sustainability goals, or into, again, regulated markets. So credits like this that are being generated are now contributing to voluntary carbon markets, to voluntary water quality markets, to compliance water quality markets, and then there's now efforts to add a biodiversity component on top of this. And I'm giving an example again. My work is focused very much on water quality. There are similar schemes like this evolving around biodiversity, particularly pollinator habitat, and to some extent bat species benefits, because bats in the United States are facing significant declines, particularly associated with disease. So this is the kind of system that we are really focused on. The challenge has been not getting farmers to take on these activities. There's sort of more than enough, I think, supply. It's the technical assistance to help farmers or producers figure out what to do. That's a huge limitation. And the United States really lost, from roughly 1980 to 2000, lost a lot of capacity in that technical assistance space to be able to directly work with farmers out on the land. So that's a real barrier. And then the structure at the end, the demand side, is also very weak in the United States, or at least it's very variable. So some states don't implement these kinds of rules at all, even though it's a federal requirement. And in other states, it's a very strong system. So we have, sort of chaotic implementation across 50 states, and then a lot of sort of entrenched approaches that these newer approaches have to compete against, and contractors and buyers and just people used to doing the job the same way they always did it. One of the biggest barriers is the responsibility is typically on a small town or city or a village, local government, or on an industry for achieving some sort of water quality outcome. They have the responsibility to improve something, but they ultimately depend on a state water quality agency to give them the go-ahead to do that. And it's been very difficult to get states to say yes, that you can use these kinds of outcomes from results-based schemes to satisfy some of your regulatory requirements. It's not that most people are opposed, it just doesn't fit within an easy box. And so the work that my organization does, we have lots of partners who do the other things on this slide, but what we mostly focus on are the permit and agreement space over here. So we spend a lot of time talking to people in state agencies, and then a lot of time talking to city, urban leaders, people at companies, to try to figure out, what do you want to do? What makes sense for you? Is there cost savings? Is there a secondary biodiversity outcome you want to try to produce, which is increasingly happening? And then we try to figure out how the state is currently thinking about what they will or won't allow under a permit. And we've been writing on behalf of these entities agreements, contracts, in essence, that give the local government or the company enough certainty that the state will fairly credit their activities, that they go ahead and spend $200,000 or $500,000 or $1 million in these programs. And I'll just finish up with two more slides. This is an example of let me put the scheme up there, of USDA, our federal agriculture agency, just providing a $7.5 million grant to pay for some of these outcomes. So they've got an established fund that's starting to produce outcomes, and they're trying to ramp up the scale. And this schematic on the other side, I won't spend a lot of time explaining it, but it explains how it essentially is working in the United States. So we have a beneficiary contributing to a water fund at the top. That's USDA, has highlighted by this story, our Department of Agriculture, but it's also an equal amount of money from private investors. So private companies, private foundations putting money into this pot to pay for activities that produce results on agricultural lands that flow through this process of activity, implementation, design, planning, monitoring, ultimately verification, and then sale to these buyers like local cities, and then the money going back to the investors, back into the fund to pay for more activities at the other end. And then, sorry, this is my last slide. Just leaving you with 4 principles that we focus on, and we spend a lot of time explaining to people that someone has to pay back whoever paid for the initial activity. Often that's the farmer, or at least part of the expense is on the farmer. Sometimes it's these investor-backed funds that I mentioned that are increasingly relevant in the United States. The key one that is particularly something that my organization focuses on is government behavior. So getting government to be a consistent either source of demand for results backed outcomes, or being a consistent regulator of a system so that people know what to invest in and where to put money is key, what they value. That's been the biggest problem for our biodiversity markets, is that our governments cannot decide what they want. What does success look like has eluded us for a long time. The commodity has to have value or has to gain value. So regulated markets are the easiest place for something to have recognizable value, as I documented, sometimes as high as the price of cocaine. But often the value is near zero. And so it depends on philanthropy. And then the monitoring piece, the way we think of it is, no program will ever scale up if monitoring costs are greater than 10%. So we have to find a way to develop verification systems, and tracking registries, and ultimately adaptive management even. It's really not going to be any more than 5 to 10% of the cost, or we're never going to get past a pilot scale. So thank you all for your time. I'll stop there, and I hope that met your time requirement, Brendan.
Absolutely, Timothy. I think we could have listened to you for another hour, because there's as many questions. It's something very radically different from what we're used to here, but fascinating nonetheless. And I know we'll hopefully have an opportunity if people want to put questions in the chat box. We'll try and address them later, or else maybe they can look up your website as part of the program. Just in terms of the landowner or the farmer's perspective, Timothy, how do they respond to these? Do they, in some cases, get longer term contracts to deliver certain outcomes? And do they have to, abandon their farming activities and farm in a completely different way? Or is it a case of modifying their farming activity and so on? Can you tell us a little bit about the farming side?
Yeah, it's a mix of all of those things. So we have farmers who see any of these outcomes as more profitable. In the United States right now, 40% of net farm income comes from the government, comes from government subsidy. So if farmers see a more valuable commodity in these kinds of things, they're happy to give up land. And we're seeing that in a small fraction of producers. In many other cases, they're still working lands, so especially the water quality work. You're still operating those lands in near the same kind of levels of productivity. So that's happening as well. There's also an increasing use of technology. So to basically look at a farm and identify which acres of the farm, which hectares of the farm, the farmer is actually making a net profit from, and which hectares, even though they don't realize it, they're losing money from. The yield for that acre is just lower. And so you increasingly using satellite data to find that optimization of profit for producers, and then figuring out how to use the lower value stuff still for production, but for even less production to deliver environmental outcomes. And then there's, of course, a category of innovators who are just looking for, new ways to deliver value, new ways to brand, their products. And those producers, those farmers and ranchers, are increasingly looking at these kinds of approaches as ways to both add value and then also to define their products.
And Timothy, you mentioned before the challenge around, securing, if you're a landowner or a farmer, securing the proper support and advice on how to do this. Is that kind of demand led? Does the farmer contract in expertise to do it, or is there services available publicly to advise a farmer on how to farm for environmental
Yeah, it's really a mix. So there are government agencies who are available to some extent. There are nonprofits, and we actually work with a nonprofit called the Sand County Foundation, which gives annual awards to producers in 17 states, but also provides technical assistance. But many farmers and producers are buying those kinds of services side by side with their seeds and their fertilizer and other inputs. So companies that provide basically products to, supply chain products to farmers are increasingly also delivering sustainability advice to those farmers.
Interesting. We could talk for longer, but maybe in the interest of time, I'm going to move on to our next speaker. So thank you very much, Timothy. That was very stimulating and interesting and really good to hear from you. Our next speaker is Dr. John Finn. And John works with Tagascare in Ireland, who are the Food Advisory Authority and Farming Advisory Authority. And John is the editor of a recent book on result-based payment schemes in Ireland and I guess how they've evolved over time and what we might look forward to in future. So it's very much a case study in how these RBPS programs have worked in one of the European member states. So John, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Brendan, and thanks to the Burren Winterage School for the opportunity to talk about our work. As I said, the aim here today is to share the lessons from a number of case studies that Brendan mentioned, our recent book, in which we feature locally led results-based approaches for farming for nature. So these are very strongly biodiversity-based objectives, and I want to, it's probably fitting that we're back at the Burren Winterage Festival with this book, given that the genesis of this came a number of years ago when a group of people said it's about time we had a book that would collect these case studies and share the experience in a way that would be available for other people. So that idea came from Eileen O'Rourke and was supported by all of these people here. And this book is freely available to download at this address. So the case studies in the book are based on a number of projects that have been running in Ireland, including the Kerry Life project in the bottom left there, which focuses on conservation of the highly endangered freshwater pearl mussel. The Arran Life project, which is focused on conservation of species-rich grassland, and similarly the Burren programme. And also the RBPS project, which was mentioned previously, which is focusing on, again, grassland and species and habitat conservation of high priority biodiversity objectives. The National Parks and Wildlife Service also have a chapter in the book which features their results focused approach, even though it's not a results based payment, while they're approaching that at the moment. But that's nationally distributed with a very large number of small, more locally led efforts that are very interesting. In addition, there's a review by Eileen of the prescription-based versus results-based approaches. James Moran contributes a chapter on the policy context for all of this, and I do a conclusions and synthesis element in the book based here at Teagasc and Johnstown Castle in Wexford. I've been a hurler on the ditch for some of these projects, and in others, including the new EIPs, been engaged in more senior ground hurling and heavy tackling. So there's a nice overview there to be able to draw some lessons from all of these. So these lessons, we would say, first of all, people matter. And Ireland is, compared to Timothy's example previously, I suppose Ireland is still a small enough country that individuals can make a big difference. I love this image here from the Kerry Life project, and I wonder, are there 5 participants in this tractor or 1? And you can see how they've taken the open door policy to the maximum. And that engagement with local communities, and especially the role of local champions, is something that came through very, very strongly in all of our case studies. The engagement by local project teams who tended to be embedded in the local community for these projects really facilitated an awful lot of trust. That regular communication and regular contact between the local community and the project team was essential for changing attitudes as the project progressed, but at the very beginning was extremely important to enter into a spirit of co-creating solutions where farmers' traditional knowledge was valued as much as the more specialized scientific or academic expertise that other people brought to the projects. And coming through all of this is the sense of that the pride of place that emerges from these projects is extremely important, and again contributes to that attitudinal change where biodiversity is more valued as a result of the project. Other people are involved in these partnerships, and we see that the availability of agri-environmental expertise, whether that's through ecologists as academics or ecologists as practitioners, is extremely important. And as the previous speaker said, the role of farm advisors was absolutely crucial, that there is a whole process at play here, and the role of specialist advice that can focus on the ecological aims available at a farm scale proved to be a common theme through all of the projects. Another lesson that we learn is that prior expertise enhanced success. And most of these projects had a prior project or prior expertise that contributed to the success of the current project. So for example, the Burren program was preceded by the Burren Life project. The Kerry Life project was preceded by a lot of work by the National Park and Wildlife Service over several years. The Arran Life program, the Arran Life project had been preceded by a lot of work by the European Forum for Nature Conservation and Pastoralism and others. So this prior expertise really contributes a lot, including farmers' traditional knowledge, the people with experience of designing these kinds of intervention logics, the design of scoring schemes, project management, and specialist advice, and so on. And they facilitate smart objectives. You have evidence-based contributions from these experts. It facilitates the design of effective scoring schemes and payment arrangements, and also is a source of innovation that helps the projects as they run on. I think one of the surprising things at times is, in one sense, how simple some of these schemes can be, or these approaches can be, where the user interface between the project and the farmer can be relatively simple. Okay, that's relatively is a strong word, but it can be relatively simple. Yet that relatively simple interface is underpinned by quite a considerable amount of complexity. So that's why we draw this conclusion that this complexity in the backroom design phase really explains why that prior expertise is so important when you've got, indicators of ecological condition that are quantified in some way in a scoring sheet that then lead to payment scales. And then you've got other issues at play as well, like IT systems and databases to underpin recording, monitoring and verification, all leading to a relatively simple contract between the farmer to produce these outcomes. And so that's why I say this apparent simplicity is underpinned by complexity, and the prior expertise contributes to reducing that complexity as a barrier for a project design. Looking to the future, you'd also see that the networking of the current expertise would be very important for promoting future success. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about how these results-based payments actually delivered high priority biodiversity objectives, because these case studies are in the book. So I'll fast forward through that and encourage you to look at the book to get some more of that information. But one example comes from the Arran Life project. And here you can see within a 2-year period, an example of a scoring of fields in the project, where a low score indicates low ecological condition, as on the bottom right here, and a higher score indicates higher ecological condition with a lot more of high priority and plant species of high conservation value. Within this 2-year period, you can see the switch in the score level 5 from relatively low to relatively high within a 2-year period, indicating this shift leftward on this graph and an improvement in ecological condition. So one of our lessons learned from that, and there are others in the book, is that effective delivery of these results can be seen within relatively short timescales. And also, you can have delivery but not be able to show it. And in this case, delivery was quantified and demonstrated by monitoring. And as we know from many of the European Court of Auditor reports, that's not necessarily a given with a lot of agri-environment or biodiversity approaches for conservation. So this effective monitoring of outcomes is extremely important, and for a number of reasons. First of all, it's it's important that we have indicator data to quantify the ecological effectiveness for a whole pile of fairly obvious reasons. The rapidity of the monitoring, or the fairly short, sometimes annual timescales which this data is updated and actually influences the payments to farmers, means that it's extremely important to, first of all, make payments to farmers that are real time, reflecting the achievements. It confirms that the achievements have happened. Very important and an important role of evaluation is that we learn to improve. And several of the projects have actually adaptively managed as they've gone on in terms of changing threshold levels or payment rates, and learned to improve in real time, which I think is really, really important in terms of the positive perception of the project for the participating farmers, but I think is also very important for the public perception that these kinds of investments are delivering. And this information can contribute to formal evaluation, which probably something we'll talk about more later. A very common question that we get is, should we then focus on results-based payments, or should we focus on action-based payments? And maybe this is a little bit of an Irish answer to an Irish question, and the result is a blend of approaches was most effective. It's not an either-or approach. So we see in some of the projects a combination of results-based payments, non-productive investments, and prescription-based payments. So just to focus on the non-productive investments for a moment. So these tend to be payments for capital infrastructure. So these tend to be green infrastructure that facilitates or overcomes an obstacle on farm, which is hindering the application of results-based approach. So I'll give some examples of that in a moment. And just reflecting more generally, you know, I think as we look at approaches for the future and we see this blend of approaches, I raised the question, are there systematic criteria that might inform what's the relative contribution of results-based approaches, non-productive investments, or prescription-based approaches that are applicable to different situations? Can we have some sort of a rubric that guides in what situations is the relative contribution of these most appropriate? So to an example, back down to the Kerry Life project, where we see here an example of a results-based payment which paid farmers for their grazing management. And the important issue here was to control, in this picture on the left-hand side, was to control the amount of sediment flowing from the land into the streams to these really, really important breeding grounds for the freshwater pearl mussel. And depending upon the amount of bare soil that was reduced, the farmers got a result-based payment. On the right-hand side, we see an example of a non-productive investment where there was a need to control the cattle access to this area. And so the project pays as a capital investment for the erection of fencing. Another great lesson from the results-based approaches here, where it's less about prescribing to farmers what exactly they must do, and is more about presenting the solution that should be attained and letting them figure out, and using their traditional knowledge and innovation, how to solve that problem. And this area here has very, very shallow soils, and the farmer himself came up with the idea of erecting this A-frame fencing, which is balanced on the surface of the ground, and it is thoroughly effective in excluding the animals from access to this very, very important breeding ground for freshwater pearl mussels. So it's this combination of different payment types seems to be, it is most apparent in all of those projects and case studies that we looked at. In this example, the results-based payments in terms of the proportion of the payments that were made to the farmers was 25%. The non-productive investments comprised 55%, and the action-based payments were 20%. Just looking at the Kerry Life payment rates. So here, for example, on the top in the green box, you can see how the area, the critical source area with this risk of transport of sediment into the stream, there's a results-based payment related to the amount of bare soil that varies from €0 per hectare to €100 per hectare, depending on the degree to which the target is achieved. And then on the bottom, you can see the non-productive investment payments for that green infrastructure like fencing, footbridges, and gates. So moving on to another example in the Iron Life project. Again, on the left, you can see the impact of a results-based approach, where results-based payments and participation is occurring on the left-hand side. of this stone wall. And on the right-hand side, you can see the exact opposite of what is aimed for in terms of good conservation quality in these areas. On the right-hand side in general, with the rainwater catcher and the maintenance of the stone walls, maybe reinstallation of gates and fences, although the stone walls don't have gates and fences, but there's ways in and out of the stone walls. The control of, sorry, excuse me one moment. So, for example, the use, the opening up of these boreens and laneways and access by animals into parts of the farmland that wouldn't otherwise be accessible is facilitated by non-productive investments. The erection or maintenance of these rainwater catchers is again facilitated by non-productive investments. And again, the availability of water in the more inaccessible parts of the island is a direct obstacle for farmers to transport or to take the animals there and leave them there with a supply of water. So this is a great example of how, again, these non-productive investments are overcoming an initial obstacle, providing green infrastructure, and subsequently you can implement results-based payments following that capital investment. So coming back to that blended approach, we see these three things contributing to that. And as I said, it's not an either or choice. And these three approaches can be complementary. They can be targeted where they're best suited. These non-productive investments are important for kickstarting assistance. And I also point out the nature of these prescription-based payments changes. I mean, prescription-based payments very often have a bit of a negative press. But in this case, we see that especially in National Parks and Wildlife approach, which didn't have results-based payment, but we'd say that the nature of their prescription-based payments is extremely targeted and probably more targeted than average. The same in Kerry Life, because they're so focused on specific objectives and clear targets that the prescriptions are very, very much more targeted than we'd normally expect because of that. Coming on to the structure of the financial incentives, and I'm taking an example here from the Burren program, and there's actually lots more of these examples coming from the European innovation projects. So what's going on here is, just to explain, on the left-hand side here, we have a score which represents ecological condition, and the higher the score, the better the ecological condition. The payments are staggered, again, as a results-based payment, so that you get this very obvious increase in payment as you increase the ecological condition of the farm or farmland. And then there's an element that considers the area of the farm, with the greater area beyond a certain area receiving a slightly less payment. But we can see here the results-based approach in action in terms of the financial structure of the payments. Just to make a few points on this. So first of all, we see that the low scores are penalized, so that scores in this case below 5 or 5 or lower get no payment. So there's a very strong incentive to increase the score. There is a reduction of risk in year 1 and 2. So in the first 2 years when a farmer participates, they're eligible for this payment at score 5. But once they start year 3, anything with a 5 or lower gets no payment. So you have this, again, this incentive to improve all of the time. We see a strong incentivization for the improvement of the good side, the good sites, as you go from 8 to 9 to 10, for example. But we also see how the scheme is very clever in targeting the improvement from bad to good sites, because the priority enrollment means that, for example, if a farm has 40 hectares of field conditions with 5 or less, and another 40 hectares with field conditions of 6, 7, or 8. The first 40 hectares that's enrolled in this higher scoring, this higher paying regime here, is the lowest scoring. So what you see is this really strong incentivization, where the enrollment of the lowest scoring fields in the highest paying scale really focuses attention and preferentially incentivizes improvement at that point. Now, if you're a neutral observer, you might say that's ingenious. Maybe if you're a farmer, you'll say it's devious. As an economist, you'll say it's efficient. And as an ecologist, we would say it's very effective. And okay. So looking to the future, this is a quick train of thought as I come towards the end. one of the immediate challenges, I think, is how do we scale up? If we assume that there is a need for results-based approaches, and we had a very strong indication yesterday that this is the case, clear considerations are the administration costs, and how do we achieve an economy of scale do we get an economy of scale as projects scale up? How do we cope with the favored locally led and the very effective locally led approach when approaches become much bigger? Is there sufficient capacity of trained personnel? And can we develop and share more technological solutions that enhance productivity of those personnel? More broadly, and this is being achieved by the results-based network that Wolfgang introduced and the Burren Winterage School itself, there's a real need for effective networks to share the existing expertise and solutions, of which there is an awful lot. We focused on biodiversity, but looking to the future, and even within those projects, it's clear that there are other benefits to soil health, probably greenhouse gas emissions, soil carbon sequestration. And I think explicitly incorporating these other multiple ecosystem services is an interesting challenge for the future. Lena may talk next about landscape scale approaches or collective actions, and also how do we have market-based rewards where it's not just public payments for public goods, but how do we also internalize some of these these higher environmental approaches and reputation associated with food production in these areas, and incorporate that into market-based rewards. So just very briefly, I want to focus on the scaling up, and really I frame it like this, and the challenge is, how do we go from case study approaches, pilot projects, small programs into much wider programs? And this is a real challenge. And I think we're already heading that direction, where we see, even in the current projects, where we've got approximately, in the region of 50 farmers, scaling up to Cueve Nuaran, which has about 127, and up to, real program level projects, which have up to, 500 to 1,500 farmers. And I guess there's another step beyond. Can we see a results-based approach that might have 15,000 farmers? And what would that look like? Here, kind of motivated by yesterday's discussion, I started thinking about this, and I did this morning. So apologies if it's somewhat preliminary. But can we start thinking about? I see. I need to hurry up. So can we start thinking about the direction, the categorization of future approaches in terms of the degree of environmental ambition and difficulty, and the geographical coverage of that objective, and how that might shape the structure of future projects and approaches, and the incorporation of results-based parts. So I'll skip forward to say, in conclusion, then we see how our lessons focus on how targeting of these high priority and complex objectives with co-creation of solutions with communities, specialized expertise, incorporating the evidence base with good structured financial incentives, and the importance of farm scale advice all mean that we can show how results-based approaches can deliver these high priority and complex objectives. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was a very interesting presentation, and I'd recommend people maybe check out the publication John referred to, because there's a lot of detail there about scorecards and monitoring approaches and the impact of different programs. So it's very interesting. And I was laughing, John, at your comment about farmers considering our scoring system devious, which is interesting. But I actually think one thing we don't maybe emphasize enough is that I'm convinced that from the farmer's perspective, a result-based approach is really, really positive, because it affords farmers respect for their experience in innovation that I think they deserve, and it also affords them a greater degree of trust, I guess. So farmers really love having freedom to farm and flexibility, and I think one really strong benefit of result-based approaches is that we don't tell the farmer what to do. We tell them what we want as an outcome, and the farmer is free to pursue that.
Agreed.
Thank you very much, Sean. We'll move on, because we've got a really interesting presentation now from our next speaker, Lena Schaller. Lena works with the Console project. She's based in Vienna, and she's been doing a lot of research into result-based approaches across Europe. So we thought it essential to include Lena here today to share some of the lessons learned from that piece of research. Lena, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, I hope that you can see my presentation also in the presentation mode. Can some? Yeah, perfect.
Perfect.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Lena Schaller. I am from agricultural economist at the Institute of Agricultural and Forestry Economics at the University of Natural Resources and Life Sciences in Vienna, so also from Austria. I have been invited by Brendan, many thanks, to present some of the outcomes of the H2020 European project Console, and particularly some lessons learned from over 60 case studies we did. And perhaps I think it's important that I very quickly present the project. So the project is an H2020 project. We are 24 partners in 13 European countries. It's now half time. We started May 2019, and it's coordinated by the University of Bologna, Davide Biaggi. And as you can see, the Console title is Contract Solutions for Effective and Lasting Delivery of Agri-Environmental Climate Public Goods by EU Agriculture and Forestry. So you see the focus is on contract solutions, and it's on agri-environmental climate public goods, by which we mean things like biodiversity, soil quality, water quality, but also more complex constructs like rural viability and vitality, cultural heritage, landscapes and scenery. So the huge bundle of public goods that is now discussed in the context of agriculture and forestry. And what you see down on this slide is the main objective: to boost innovation in the lasting delivery of such agri-environmental and climate public goods. And what we mean by innovation in the context of Console is innovation in those contract solutions. So not classical agri-environmental schemes, but something new. And looking at such cases that already exist in Europe, but also beyond. We also have some cases also from the United States and from New Zealand and so on via a literature review, but actually we wanted to see what is already there, what can we learn from it, how are those contracts constructed, what is the design that make them successful. And what we mean by innovative contracts is not only result-based contract solutions, but we also look at solutions that implement a collective implementation. So public goods are provided not only by single farmers, but a collective of land managers, farmers, or foresters. We also try to include the value chain-based contract solutions, so where the value chain steps in somehow to foster the provision of public goods from agriculture. And last but not least, we are looking at contracts that are land tenure contracts, so meaning that it's leasing contracts with environmental clauses. And why I show all of them now, but will now focus on the ones that are result-based in our sample of 60 case studies, is that many of our case studies are mixtures of those different approaches. And we have already heard that this might be also very important, very often is the solution. So we have a lot of hybrids, and it's not even so easy to separate those categories from each other. So this is only something I wanted to say at the beginning. The contract solutions, we had a webinar on Monday in Console, and I also already presented the slides. So who might have been there has seen that already. We have been looking at existing examples in 9 European countries, and they were 18. So the ones that were there, they saw already those, the ones on the left-hand side, and this pillar here. What I added now for today is 3 more, which are like also hybrids that have perhaps a stronger element of something else. For example, collective, like you can see here in the carbon market program, it's a value chain, cooperative and result-oriented program. And those are also mixtures, and we have put the other elements stronger, but actually these are all solutions that are somehow mixtures and hybrids. That's why I wanted to put them all. And what we learned from them, so perhaps very quickly how we collected them. We have this partner consortium, and all of us started in our countries to try to find 4 of those new innovative contract types. And we talked to the initiative, so we might even also have a little bit of a bias how successful they are, because we talked to the initiatives themselves. There might be also some critical voices about them, but we have classified them as successful examples. And what you see is that they are available, result-based schemes are available already only in our samples for huge bandwidth of land use systems. Like they exist in forestry, they exist in arable land, they exist on landscape, like for example in Austria on farmer level. So there are a lot of good solutions and examples already in place for in a lot of different context situations. I think this is something very important that comes out of this project. What we also see, and this is what I already indicated, a lot of those, and they are those with, that are highlighted in yellow now, are mixtures. They are not like a classical hard classified result-based payment scheme where results are where you get the farmers or foresters get paid by the results in public good provision they deliver, but they have many other elements. What I find really interesting are those things that include the carbon market, like for example this Finnish situation, which is also a peatland example, or the hamster example in France, which is a collaborative actually scheme, because you need to establish a whole habitat for the hamster. But if then the hamster is on your field and you find a hamster burrow, then the farmer gets an extra result-based payment. So there is a lot of elements of different contract types in them, but I think that makes them very successful. And we also saw that especially the collective elements in the contracts are very often very enhancing the effectiveness. Something I always wanted to show you is that they are also available, even if we have been talking a lot about biodiversity, and you see those insects, they represent biodiversity. Yeah, many of those result-based schemes at the moment are dealing with biodiversity, but there are also other solutions. So we have some for carbon sequestration, we have some for water quality, we have some also on landscape level that look at a broader bundle of public goods. So I think there are many options, and you can learn a lot from the examples that are already here. Also, what was astonishing is that we did not find so many that are already included into the rural development programs of the countries, but many of those result-based schemes really are developed locally and by many private associations, by private initiatives, by motivators, by NGOs. So this is something, of course, different from other types of schemes. For example, collective implementation is very often already included into the rural development programs. But there are already solutions, and I think it's really important to look at them and how they are included into those five-year schemes that the rural development programs offer. Some general lessons learned. I know that my presentation was scheduled for 10 minutes, so I'm very fast, perhaps, but then we can discuss some general lessons learned. I mean, I have to say that really many of the things that John already put forward, we really also saw. I mean, it's really important that in those examples, there was always a strong engagement of the initiatives of regional actors. There are strong motivations, and things are really starting from the top here. And people have been developing those things very often together with the farmers. What we also see is that there are already many successful examples in Europe. And what I also have to say, that if you use the classical definition that you pay, that result-based payments are really payments by results, and in our case enhancing public goods, there are still few that really use for example, carbon dioxide as an indicator, so really public good and this indicator, but very often they are mixtures, or they use dummies or proxies for payments, or even the payments are somehow oriented on the actions that are taken. What is also important at the moment, they are very specific and very targeted, with very specific and very targeted indicators. So I think really the question of upscaling those indicators is, and make those indicators easy and reliable also on a larger scale, and also measurable, is really a question, especially if you think of biodiversity with all the different habitats and the different target species. So I think good solutions here are crucial. Also, they have, what we also saw, all our examples, very intensive elements of teaching and advice at the moment. And what we were astonished, actually, the aspect of automatization or digitalization and digitally measuring results, which is so important in result-based schemes are very often not very much integrated yet, but it's really thought, and there is really a need that some more is automatized in result measuring and also with remote techniques and those things. I think there's a lot to do still. And this is a last statement I want to make. I don't want it to sound too negative, but what we also say, so you need a very informed land management society to be able to implement those schemes. They must know about indicators. They must know about their agriculture. They don't have solutions, management solutions. They have they get prescribed, but they do have to think on their own, which makes it also so exciting, of course. Very last, we had some in-depth analysis, and I want to make 3 statements from that as second lessons learned. What we saw is that result-based payment schemes were the ones that were really applied in intensive farming systems. And I think this is really interesting that intensive farmers are interested in those cases, because these are the ones we need to join when we really want to make a change in the agriculture system and in the provision for public goods. And what we also found was, and I always highlighted that in bold letters, that the aspect of targeting is of course very important, and what makes this aspect successful is when the conservation objectives are farm and plot individually elaborated to, in best case, direct collaboration with the farmers. This makes it very effective, but also makes it, of course, complicated. And then the last thing, John also mentioned, that you need the whole thing still to be clear and easy, and it needs to be transparent for the farmer. You need transparent technical procedures of the measurement and the upscaling. And finally, for the farmers, very important that they see the direct relationship between the management and the results to step in. Yeah, very last slide. Because we have been asking on our Monday webinar, we had 100 guests, and we were asking all our guests, what are you most interested in our 4, 5, and including the action-oriented payment schemes? What are you most interested in? And we had not, it was not a result-based payment network workshop, but it was a workshop inviting everybody. And what we saw is that 44% of our guests are really interested in the result-based and result-oriented schemes. And I think this is really something that shows us again that we should continue here with the research and look how we can improve those schemes, because we have a lot of good examples already out there. So I can only invite you. We have for all our case studies, we did fact sheets. So all of the 60 case studies, you find them on our website. So if you're interested, just check it out and have a look on those successful examples. And it's only left for me to say thank you to all console partners and my team at BOKU, Theresa Eichhorn, Jochen Kantler. Theresa Eichhorn is also in the auditorium. And yeah, perhaps we still have some minutes for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lena, and thank you for fitting so much into such a short period of time.
Sorry.
I kind of do apologize for the amount of information we're getting in the last hour, but all of the information and the presentations will be available afterwards for you to have to look into at your leisure. And there's lots of good resources. John's publication and those fact sheets as well, Lena, I think they're a really useful resource. I just listening to what you have there, by the way, before I just begin to finish off, there's a really good opportunity for people to ask specific questions of the speakers via the chat function. I know John and also Timothy are very active in responding to queries there, so I'd encourage you to continue to do that. And just one reflection, I think, from sitting back and looking on, there's so much complexity and there's so much diversity, and there's so many different approaches to different objectives. It can be a little bit daunting, I guess, Lena, looking at your presentation. But I think actually that's a wonderful thing as well, because nature is complex and the environmental challenges we face are complex. And it's great that we aren't looking at a uniform approach to tackling these problems. I think we do need bespoke approaches and bespoke bases. It allows for greater responsiveness, greater targeting of measures, and greater engagement on behalf of the stakeholder as well. So I think the complexity can seem daunting, but I think it's necessary in terms of the approaches. And the other thing I'd say is that I know for some people looking from the outside in, result-based might seem complicated. But from somebody who's been working with the result-based program for 10 years, I think it's the simplicity which is really striking. I think it's a very simple, logical approach. We want farmers to deliver something, we pay them when they deliver it, and we advise them how to do it. It's very simple. So I think the point about complexity is important. It needs to be accommodated, but it's really important that farmer on the ground has a very simple message about what we as a society want him to do. So I think we're welcoming back our room 2. As far as I can see, the numbers are building up again. So I hope that room 2 was a success, and I think hopefully our colleague Wolfgang is available to come back to us, Wolfgang, and to summarize what took place in session 2 or room 2. Are you there, Wolfgang? Wolfgang is lost in space. We'll give him another minute. Is there anybody else from room 2 or room 1 who'd like to make a comment from the panel? Any pressing points? Okay, I was just advising our members from room 1 that if anybody has any questions for any of the speakers today, if you could use the chat function, it's a good opportunity to get a direct response while you're at the meeting from those present. So I think Wolfgang isn't back with us just yet, but I see that James Moran is with us. So maybe James, if you're willing, we might get you to summarize maybe, or reflect at least on the findings from, or the presentations from room 1. James, over to you.
Hello all. I think it was very interesting and fascinating presentations. I very much like seeing Timothy's, first of all, the US approach, which is quite different than what we see in a European context, where much of the design and implementation of agri-environment programs are really driven by public policy and the design of our common agricultural policy. Whereas if I'm right, Timothy, a lot of the work there is driven by the private sector and sort of biodiversity offsetting, and money comes from developers having to pay into a pot of money to offset their impact on the environment through developments and constructions. And it creates this pot of money that you need somebody actually to develop high quality environments to offset some of them development impacts. And I see the scale of the money that potentially you have available from the private sector means that you have to maybe scale this up quite rapidly. And I also liked your points about trying to keep the actual administration costs low when you do scale up. And it's very interesting to see this modeled approach. So payments based on the models. And I see in a response to a question I had that it's more subtle than all the payments simply going on what the model results are, that there are indicators measured on the farm that inform the level of payments together with the model payment as well. And I think this was a theme we seen as the presentations went on. We saw that essentially it wasn't a one size fits all, and that there was this combination of and hybrid of approaches. And even when we got as far as Lena, where she mentioned everything from the results-based approaches to the collectives to other quite novel approaches. And also, these are often in a final individual program, as John pointed out, they can be combined quite successfully, where you have your traditional action-based approaches, results-based payments, and the prescriptions all included into the one contract for the farmer. And the targets we're dealing with are quite complex in terms of biodiversity, climate, water, etc. And what I like very much is that we're at a stage now, both bringing sort of prior knowledge from a range of actors, understanding what has been done with agri-environmental scheme design over the last 20 or 25 years, really, across the globe. We can capture that back room. I think it was John that coined the phrase there, this back room complexity of the situation, and quite simple interfaces for the farmers that we can also quantify in terms of ongoing monitoring to be it the taxpayer or the private sector industry who's investing in this, that the actual results are being delivered. So my take-home messages from this so far from session 1 were we need a hybrid of approaches. It's not just one size fits all. We use our range of tools to design an approach for specific targets or bundle of targets in a particular geographical area. There's a real need for strong engagement and communication between the range of stakeholders involved, and there's this need for continuous dialogue and communication as adaptation, particularly as we scale up our approaches. And we can capture this complexity, but have relatively simple contracts to implement them, which is key, I think, to the success of these.
Thanks very much, James. That was a really good summary, I think, of what was a very broad-ranging and full part of the session one. I see Wolfgang has joined us. We thought we'd lost you in the ether there, Wolfgang. You're welcome back. So would you like to make some attempt at summarising maybe some of what you heard in session 2, please?
Yes. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Brendan. You will never lose me, just to tell you that. Even you can't see me. We had in this session two very interesting projects and approaches. One of Austria. The summary message was there. In Austria, there is a very broad program in the agri-environment sector with 80% of farmers in Austria participating. And one part of this big agri-environmental scheme with the high participants is the result-based scheme, which is focused also on advising and supporting and educating the farmers to make something better on their farm. So there was one question, how we prepared all this scheme, how we financed the preparation of the scheme. It was paid also by European money, so by Article 20 of the Rural Development Program of the past or existing Rural Development Program. The system was that specific indicators set up together with the farmer and one expert on the field. And these indicators are monitored by the farmer and paid by the ministry if they of course have success with the management. Management is free, so it's up to be decided by the farmers. There was a question if there is some specification on specific agro ecosystems on this scheme. There is no. It is open for vineyards, for grassland, for arable land. In the practice, it's more used in grassland, but it is also used in arable land for developing specific flower strips, etc. In the future, Austria wants to enlarge the program. Now it's focused on a pilot scheme with 150 farmers. It is planned to enlarge that to up to 1,000 farmers and to include not only biodiversity, also climate and soil protection. There was a question in the seminar, why more or less not water protection. For water protection, it was discussed, but there was a decision that it is a bit too complicated to really clarify what kind of indicators is really linked to the farmer and what indicators are linked to other influences on the water. So that was the system and the discussion of the result-based scheme in Austria. Then we heard a very interesting contribution of Sönke from now I know the English the English definition Landcare Germany Association from Deutschen Landschaftspflegeverband, and they try to implement public goods in the ecosystem with a points scoring system. So their message is give public goods a price. They developed different kind of measures, 19 measures, and also a scoring system according the expected effects. And then the calculations by scientific people. There was no further explanation about that because that was too complicated. But it is about €50 for 1 point, which they measure, and then you are free to decide which kind of measures you want to do on the farm. There were some important measures from Sönke. The system has more or less 3 characters. It should be simple, so not only be for 20 or 30 or 10% of the farmers in the country. It should be available for everybody. So it should be day limitable and administrable. So they try to put one general ecologic effect in the eco scheme to reach more or less a broad improvement of environment and also of climate. So it was very interesting, and we all wish Germany good success and progress in this completely new approach for eco schemes, especially because eco schemes have become a new concrete picture in the last 2 days. That was it from my side.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang, from the Austrian delegation and also the case study in Germany. Much appreciated. I think it might be useful right now just to maybe invite back in Timothy Mail from the US to maybe offer his perspective on what we've been talking about here, because I know in Europe we've been talking about results-based for quite a while, so sometimes it's good to hear an objective perspective on the whole thing. So Timothy, if you'd like to comment on what you've heard so far.
Yeah, sure. This has really been fascinating for me. We don't have anything like this kind of community of practice in the United States. There's just not a set of people to talk through this kind of technical detail with at a broad scale, right? So on one specific issue, you might have a group of people, but not at the kind of level of sharing and learning that you all have. So I learned an amazing amount in this session, and I wish that I could have been simultaneously in both. A point that I think came up during Lena's presentation that I'd just note is this complexity issue. And I think the key thing, and Brendan, you said this really well, is that from the farmer's perspective, it needs to be simple. But there's lots of complexity behind the scenes. It's fantastic, right? I think of a seatbelt in a car. I get in the car, I put the seatbelt in, I click the button, I go. But there's engineers that work on seatbelts every single day and talk about seatbelt design, and I don't need to know anything about that. And I'm really glad they work on it. We're like that community of engineers that works on seatbelts. So I mean, that's the kind of like healthy complexity that I heard about today, iterative design, moving from a beta model to a more advanced, 2.0, 3.0, 4.0 versions of metrics and of accounting systems and of payment schemes. So that's really been fantastic. Your all's focus on biodiversity is much stronger than the system in the US. So we're very much catching up on the biodiversity side of things. So really fascinating there. And what I've learned through a little bit of a shallow dive into some of your projects, like around payments associated with raptor nesting success or pollinator diversity. There's a lot that we could learn from there. Just last comment, I've been part of some exchanges with Chinese government officials who have come to the United States to learn about various ways of contracting for ecological outcomes. That same kind of opportunity really needs to exist between the US and the EU and Europe. Our US Department of Agriculture, our state agricultural officials would have their sort of minds blown open by hearing about the kinds of things that you all are working on. And I think similarly, all of you and your government counterparts would have a similar benefit by seeing, the way these systems are evolving in the US. So really a lot of similarities, and then, the terminology and some of the innovation is quite distinct and really useful to learn about. Thank you.
Thanks, Timothy. Really interesting. And I think likewise, we've learned a lot from what you had to say, particularly around, as you said, the focus on water. I know it was a question earlier, but that strong focus you have on watershed management over there. For another perspective, maybe I'd like to invite Corina Roe to say a few words. Corina is from the Irish Department for Agriculture, Food and the Marine. And this ministry has been very active in funding result-based programs and projects in Ireland over the last number of years. And I think recently in our budget, a couple of weeks ago, there was an announcement of more funding. So maybe Corina, you'd like to come in and share some of your perspectives from the ministry.
Brendan, thank you very much. Can everyone hear me okay? Thumbs up will do, Brendan.
Yeah, all good.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much. Look, apologies for being late on the session this morning or this afternoon. I was here all day yesterday, and I can only say that the investment by the department, and I suppose the confidence that the Minister placed over successive governments in the results-based programmes, including the Burren programme and the Henna Harrier now, and the different results-based programs we have under the EIPs, that has been, I think we can see a definite return to that. And, you know, it is clear that we are getting benefits from the bottom-up approach, and that these are the type of benefits that we are going to need if we are to achieve what we need to achieve for our climate and environmental ambitions, you know. So in the CAP strategic plan, my unit is also involved in developing that plan. So I have the rural development programme currently, where we have the EIPs and we have the results-based programmes. And as Brendan has mentioned here, we have recently secured an increase in budget for the continuation of those programmes in the transitional period. We're also looking at how we can take the learning, I think, from those EIPs and from the results-based programmes, and how we can look at scaling that up. So the discussions yesterday afternoon with the EIP groups, the Irish EIP groups, was around what measures do they think were possible to scale up, and what measures would not scale up and are better delivered at a local level. So I know you would have heard from John Finn earlier on around, who works in our Chagas on the Research and Advisory Board. And you know, he's saying that we are doing a lot, and I think that his book there is very well worth a read for people to get a very good sense of where we are in the results-based system in Ireland. But I think it's also, he throws up a lot of interesting questions, and they're questions that are challenging, I think, particularly for managing authorities and for government departments, about how we will take a further leap of faith into the results-based system, and how we can actually realise the really good and positive bottom-up innovations that we're seeing. So I suppose we have a really good, from a policymaker, we're always looking at evidence-based policy making and how you can persuade your government, or perhaps the EU, that these are good measures, and to bring other member states along that route with you. So we've been involved in the negotiations in Brussels over the last while. And I think we can safely say one of our things was to ensure that we could continue to have results-based schemes that we already have, but also to try and build on that in preparation for the green architecture under the Common Agricultural Policy that we'll be expected to put together. So there are a lot of challenges, but I think there are also really good and positive benefits. And in Ireland, we have a culture of doing things well locally. We have the GAA and we have the parishes. And you know, we have a lot of competition between counties for GAA matches, and that also is something that comes in place, I think, when you start looking at the environment, the pride of place. And in the Burren evaluation yesterday, it was clear that, you know, people were doing things for money, but they weren't actually. They had ended up that they were actually doing things for the pride of place. They were doing it in the evening after work, they were doing it in the rain. And I think if you ask any of the colleagues there, you know, we're asking farmers to go out and do hard and difficult things. And at the same time, the world thinks that they're the cause of the problem, not the solution. But I think it's very clear when you come to these forums that there is a lot of really, really good work going on. And I think as policymakers, we're trying to gather that evidence, and then we're trying to find a way to support farmers to do that. So we have really good examples. We're really, really excited. We're excited to be leaders in this area in Europe. We're also terrified. I hope we're not being recorded, but it is a real challenge to actually turn the ambition here and to manage that and manage that expectation in a way that doesn't leave us exposed. As you know, it's not our money, it's EU taxpayers' money, it's Irish taxpayers' money, and we have to be able to account for it. So we have, I suppose, with Brendan, been a very good example in the Burren, where we have a very good programme over a long period of years. the Burren evaluation that we carried out on that, we're seeing that the benefits of the schemes are not just at a local level on this farm. We're seeing that it extends well beyond that into the communities, and that into heritage, into culture, into tourism, into well-being and a sense of place. So I think these are very important things. And in the current climate, people are more conscious of those things than ever before. You know, we really have basic needs. We want to be warm, safe, fed, have well-being, look after our families. These are basic issues. And farmers want to do the same. They also want to look after their farms, hand them on to the next generation. And it is a challenge for us to see, do we want cheap food? And if we want cheap food, how do we marry that with the environment? And I think Donald Sheehan summed it up good yesterday when he said, you know, we can actually do both. And I think that's something that we haven't really introduced farmers to in enough, that doing something well for the environment doesn't necessarily mean a cut in your income. But that is a big challenge when life has all been so far about competitiveness and improving. And, you know, what does sustainability mean? So I think that these are challenges for us as policymakers. I can say that we're up for it. I can say that we will be asking those questions of ourselves and of the Minister to say that we should have enough funding to do this. I can't say that we'll get it all right. I can't say that we'll get it perfect. And I know if nobody is happy, maybe that's as good as having only one person happy. So, you know, we have a lot to learn and we have a way to go, but we are very open to it. And I think that we will look to drive on in this space. We must look to drive on in this space because the challenges are so great that face us. What is very useful about the programs as well is I think it shows that if you have a local approach and a strong sense of leadership and ownership, that the pride of place comes through and that people perform above and beyond what money could ever reward for. So I suppose that's the aim for all of us in life, to do a job that gives us satisfaction. So I think that's the challenge really for us on that. I don't know, Brendan, if you want me to say any more other than to say you're doing great. You terrify the life out of us that we have to meet these challenges that you put in front of us, but we're up for it, and we will, you know, we will look to move on. And I suppose we see ourselves in the CAP strategic plan at trying to, under the eco schemes, look at first allowing farmers to recognise the value of what they have, and then to look to build on that through our agri-environmental measures and through our, you know, and I think we will continue to have innovation measures. We must have innovation measures because we're learning so much for it, and we are enabling farmers to teach us what they already know. They've been doing this for a long time through a lot of generations. And as my dad says to me, sure, if you only listened to me in the first place, we wouldn't be here now. So I think, you know, that's the message we all have for ourselves.
Thanks.
I can just say continue the good work, and I'll continue to listen on for the afternoon. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Corina. I think you said an awful lot, and you said it very well, and it's of major significance. And I think the real value of that contribution is that for other member state ministries who are equally terrified about dipping their toe in the water with result-based approaches, I think the experience in Ireland through the support of the Irish Ministry has been so positive that the answer would be a resounding yes. Jump right in, and you know, you can only learn. And I think particularly so in the context of the climate and biodiversity crisis, I think we're obliged to try new approaches and to take new risks. I'd like to hand back to Wolfgang to introduce our final speaker today, Frank Vassen. So Wolfgang, over to you.
So yes, we are very, very happy that Frank Vassen is with us. A warm welcome to you, Frank Vassen, also online now. Frank Vassen is working in the European Commission for in the biodiversity, DG biodiversity, and of course there's a lot of things to do currently, many challenges, many plans, and we are all very, very happy that you join us, that you are with us. Because, of course, we are very interested in the question, what is the regarding result-based schemes in Europe, and many, many countries are listening to us now, not only from Europe. What is the perspective of the European Commission, of the European Union, at least? What are the expectations, and are there any recommendations? Can I floor these questions? Can I hand out the questions to you, Frank?
I'm reasonably sure that Frank isn't
Yes,
here. I
we
don't
have
think.
again the same problem. Yeah.
I'm fine. I'm unmuted now. Yes. Hello, and yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Yes. So, well, first of all, thank you to Wolfgang for allowing me to talk to this forum. Unfortunately, I've only been able to follow a few presentations this afternoon from John Finn and Lena Schaller, and that was already very rich. So I regret that I haven't been able to follow more. Yeah, Wolfgang invited me to say a few words from the perspective of the EU or the European Commission, and to give a bit of a bigger picture from a Brussels perspective. Of course, I'm working on the Birds and Habitats Directive and Natura 2000, so on the European legislation for the conservation of biodiversity. And I think it's been said before, we are in a biodiversity crisis. And coincidentally, just yesterday during the Green Week, we are in the Green Week here in Brussels, a lot of events are taking place at the same time. Of course, everything online, everything's in confinement. We launched the State of Nature report of the EU. And this is an event that is taking place every 6 years, because we get all this information once every 6 years from the member states. So we have brand new information on the state of nature and biodiversity in all EU countries and for the EU as a whole, and the picture is not good. And unfortunately, we see that the declines are continuing. And in particular, when we talk about agricultural habitats. And why is that so? Well, you know, maybe if I look at the global perspective, I see that we also have people that are outside of the EU here. Europe has a lot of Europe's biodiversity is basically located in open, management-dependent habitats, because much of our original biodiversity has been lost. So a lot of our biodiversity needs to be actively maintained to some level of management. So we've lost the original habitats. We need to maintain these to some agricultural activities. That worked well in the past, when the agriculture was very extensive, when the technologies were not yet there to intensify. But nowadays, the biodiversity in the agricultural landscape is being lost, and there's two different phenomena. One is intensification, and the other is land abandonment. And when we talk about agricultural biodiversity in quite a few regions of Europe, actually land abandonment is the worst factor. And if you look, for example, at the diversity of butterflies in Europe, most of them are declining because of land abandonment. So we need a solution to keep people actively working in the countryside, to not only to produce biodiversity, of course, but also to produce healthy food, to keep the communities alive. And this, we need to achieve that at the European scale, because otherwise what we see is an increasing urbanization and a very large scale abandonment, and with a loss of biodiversity associated. Now, we have already working on, let's say we have been trying to find solutions for the last 20 years, agri-environmental schemes. A lot has been achieved. A lot of successes have been achieved also locally. But increasingly, we see that with these approaches, we are hitting a kind of a glass ceiling. We cannot get further than that. And there is a number of reasons for this. And I think the result-based payments offer a bit of a new hope, because it offers a new perspective, and it shows that some of the weaknesses of the traditional action-based schemes can be solved to result-based schemes. Now, I'm not an expert on this, and I don't want to go too much into the detail. You are much more competent on this. And I think, honestly, I think you are the European experts here. I think this is really the collection of all the experts on this particular subject that is coming together here. And I understand that you have already been implementing quite a few successful pilot projects, and I also heard that we need to step this up. And I think this is perhaps one of the key messages. We need to continue working on this, and we need to step it up. So in those countries where successful pilot projects have been implemented, I think we need to go to the bigger scale now. And this is the next, really the big challenge now, to make it happen at a wide scale. But there is also, don't forget about that, there's a lot of regions and countries in the EU where even the result-based payment approach is still at a very embryonic scale. And we need to make sure that this is going further, and we need to communicate and exchange. So it means that wherever, and in particular in Ireland, where we have a lot of experience on these schemes already, I think we would need to benefit from your experience in terms of bringing this also to those regions and countries where this experience currently doesn't exist. What does it mean? Well, we need exchange, and we need to promote exchange, and we need to continue further experimenting, further pilots, further demonstration, further implementation, and further information exchange. On our side, we are fully willing to support you in this, and I think it's not a secret when I tell you that we are going to launch soon a big project for promoting further exchanges on this, and I hope you will apply to this, hopefully all together, because I think it's good to have a very big community involved in this. So I would really encourage you to work on that, and I think that ultimately, where do we want to go with this? I think we should also think about establishing a European, I would say, a lobby network for these measures. We really need a permanent European partnership of all those groups and people who have been actively working on this, and to bring this idea further. And this is the scope of a call for a project that we're going to launch soon. So I would really invite you to consider this call, which we hopefully will launch in the coming months. I think that's all I can say for the moment. I'm not myself an expert on these schemes. It's a fascinating area. It requires a lot of technical expertise, and we need to widen the knowledge. We need to make more people benefit from that expertise. Myself, I'm also involved in another interesting process, which is the EU biogeographical process, the Natura 2000 process, where we bring together national authorities, stakeholders, NGOs, working on particular subjects. And I could easily imagine in the coming years that we would need further cooperation, including on the promotion of result-based schemes in the biogeographical process. So I think I'd like to stop here. I thank you for your attention. And I would like to finally to congratulate you for this great work. And I think this is really something on which we will continue to work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank, to Brussels and to your, I guess, your home, because I know that Brussels doesn't look so fine like your office now.
This is my office.
Oh, this is okay. Thank you very much for your motivating and warm words, and for the support also to the result-based schemes, for the supporting words to all the countries, also not in Europe, but out of Europe. Brendan, I hand over to you.
Yes, thanks very much, Wolfgang, and thanks, Frank, for the input. It's probably an opportune time to highlight the network that Wolfgang and Nutper and colleagues have established, the RBPS network.eu, rbsnetwork.eu, because I think Frank was referring to, coming together and pooling resources. I think that's precisely what this network is trying to do and has done in the last couple of years on a totally voluntary basis. So I think support for that network, which brings case studies and experts from across Europe together, is really important. I also note in the audience we have people from a farming background, which is great to see here, because I think farmers, their destiny is not just in food production, but in ecosystem service provision. So I think this result-based approach offers great hope and opportunity for those farmers. We have a big research community and growing across Europe. We've heard from James today, who's pioneering some of the more interesting result-based approaches here in Ireland, along with some of the EIP colleagues. We have great support at ministry level, as shown by Corina and our friends in Austria and Germany, and also from the Commission level. So we've got a lot of people pushing in the same direction. I think we really need that uniform and broad-scale support if we're to achieve anything significant as required by the challenges that we face. We have huge challenges in Europe. I think this week was another bad week in terms of the data coming out about our environment, and we really have to do something. And I think result-based, as we've said before, isn't the answer to everything, but it certainly gives us a little bit of hope for the future. I hope that farmers can be enabled and supported and rewarded for looking after the environment. They can act as first responders for environmental and climate crisis, and that science can be supportive of those farmers and policy can be supportive so they can deliver something great. So before we sign up for a quick screen break, I'd encourage all of you to look at the chat. There's a really good conversation on in the chat, huge amounts of knowledge being exchanged. So we're going to take a screen break for 15 minutes and we're going to have a really thought-provoking and ever informative, as always, Alan Buckwell will be speaking to us. So I think it's a nice gentle way to finish the afternoon. But in the meantime, anybody who's interested in finding out more, please join the chat. And please tweet BWS, hashtag BWS20 is our Twitter handle if anybody wants to share those messages. Thanks to all our speakers, thanks to our chairs, and thanks to everybody. And we will reconvene in 12 minutes to hear from Alan Buckwell. Thank you, everybody. Okay, good afternoon and welcome back, everybody. I'm delighted to see so many of our viewers have stayed with us this afternoon. We had a very, very intense first session, and I'm glad to say we'll have maybe a more time generous and thoughtful approach with this second session. We wanted to, I'm delighted we are to have Professor Alan Buckwell to speak with us this afternoon. We just thought it was appropriate maybe to do a little bit of big blue sky thinking, and no better man than Alan. Alan is a research director with the Rise Foundation, who are a pretty extraordinary group, I think, do some amazing work. He's also emeritus professor at Imperial College of London. He's an agricultural economist by background, and he's going to talk to us today about balancing policies for food and environmental security. So Alan, the very warmest of welcome to the Burren Winterage School 2020, and the floor is yours. Might just unmute, yeah, good.
Thank you very much indeed, Brendan, for the invitation, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for sticking around this late in the afternoon. I can see you've got a fantastic and intensive program at the Winterage. I heard about the Winterage from one of my Rise colleagues who I think has been there, and I must say I felt really jealous that she was actually physically able to come and participate on site. It looks a wonderful experience, both intellectually and to share that amazing environment. So thank you for the invitation to join you and to share some thoughts. These thoughts, sorry, I'm just trying to make my slide. This presentation that I've recently been engaged in. One was, some of you may know, I've wallowed in agricultural policy for 5 decades now, can you believe? My first job in 1970 in Newcastle University was to build a computer model of British agriculture to test the implications of Britain joining what was then the European Common Market. And then 5 years ago, I was asked by an organization, could I write a report on the agricultural implications of Britain leaving the European Union? So I feel my career has been bookmarked by Britain's sorry experience in being in the European Union and deciding to leave it. But I don't want to say any more about that horrible subject. But what's happened in the United Kingdom is that given that we have made this decision, it's opened a huge space for people to think about and make suggestions about where we want our food system to go now that we have to invent our own policies and then implement them. And so this thinking I've been doing is partly for the same group who asked me to write a report 5 years ago on what would be the implications of Britain leaving the European Union. And they asked me to write a report too, well, what is going to happen? And I told them, well, I still don't know because we haven't reached agreement on a trade agreement, and there's huge questions about how the UK's agricultural policy is going to work. And I said, in any case, there's much bigger questions out there that lots of people have addressed. And so I wanted to expose them, and now I'm going to expose you to that sort of much broader thinking and see where it takes us. And it starts from the prescription that the current food system is unsustainable, and I'll defend that. And then I'll summarize my perception of the debates that have been taking place here. But I noticed exactly the same debates, because I've been part of them, taking place across the European Union, or should I perhaps qualify that, the Northwest member states, particularly of the European Union, less so the further east and south you go. And to my way of looking at it, these visions, which I'll take you through, 3 of them, leave unresolved some key tensions, and particularly about food prices and what trade regime we think we're going to be operating long term for agri-food products in Europe. So having, in a sense, painted that picture and in a sense described what I see as the consensus for why we have to change, that the status quo can't survive indefinitely, what's the key policy mix and sequencing to bring about at least some of the changes that people have identified and are identifying. And then I finish with where I always do, because what else do I know about the dear old Common Agricultural Policy, which is part, but I stress only a part of this puzzle. Just for your information, if you haven't come across these were 5 reports that I found myself reading this summer. They're all substantial pieces of work, and from extremely experienced, behind them are extremely experienced and influential people in the UK scene. But to my mind, the issues and the arguments they present are just as applicable across the whole EU. Because when these lot were all written, we were and are to this day still part of the EU. One of them is by the Committee on Climate Change, another by Dieter Helm, very influential economist who certainly influenced the shape of the UK agriculture bill in a book called Green and Prosperous Land, with a subtitle, A Blueprint for Rescuing the British Countryside, therefore telling you fairly bluntly the British countryside needs rescuing. Tim Lang, who's been around food policy all his long career, his book Feeding Britain is subtitled Our Food Problems and How to Fix Them. And then a year or 2 before either of those books came out and that Committee on Climate Change report, the Royal Society of Arts and Manufacturers set up a Food, Farming and Countryside Commission, which was a group of 20 or 25 high-level, very experienced people who sat around for best part of 2 years, writing, I think, a very thoughtful report on our future in the land. And I'll pluck out at least one aspect of that. And this all comes together at the 5th of these documents, which is work in progress, where our Secretary of State for Environment, bar 2, we changed them as rapidly as most people change socks, Michael Gove asked Henry Dimbleby, who's the owner and proprietor of Leon Food Chain, if any of you have come across this, to prepare a national food strategy. Again, they've assembled a group of 20 or 30 academics, food industry, farming people, NGOs, plus quite a bit of government support to this to produce Britain's first national food strategy for 75 years, as it's described. They haven't reported yet, but it's pretty clear which way they're going. And so that's the thinking that I distill in this slide, that I think there's common agreement that our food system, now our in those 5 reports was the UK, but I've written in EU because I think this all applies. Our current food system is unsustainable. Production is unsustainable and consumption is unsustainable. The production is unsustainable environmentally. I don't have to tell anyone in this room what that is, but it's water pollution, air pollution, greenhouse gases, biodiversity degradation, loss of habitat, loss of cultural landscapes. You know the story. And as Frank Vassen was from the Commission was just saying, the state of nature, both for Europe and for Britain, demonstrates that these trends are there and they're not getting better. I would add to that, that our production system economically, our primary production system is economically unsustainable because it's structurally dependent on subsidy, the basic payment system, which is turning out to be horribly robust politically because it's voted on by the beneficiaries and turkeys don't vote for Christmas. And in a sense, the very existence of that subsidy system is an indication of the structural weakness of primary producers in the food chain, given much more concentrated upstream suppliers and downstream processors and sellers of food. And that feature, I would say, is a feature of agriculture in many, if not most parts of the world, that really is a structural problem here that none of us seem to be able to get our heads around. Second point, a big point on the slide, is that consumption's unsustainable. And this is the diet and ill health issue. The overconsumption of sugars, fats, proteins, salt, compared to dietary guidelines, leading to overweight and obesity, and then diabetes, coronary heart disease, shortened life expectancy. And the most horrifying demonstration of this is really, I don't know whether this is publicized in other countries, but it's been very plain. And in fact, in their first report of the National Food Strategy, Dimbleby documented very clearly the vulnerability to COVID-19 of those who are elderly with those pre-existing non-communicable health problems, very high amongst the death rate. So that it was a graphic illustration of what we're doing to ourselves, quite apart from the environmental costs of producing all that food, which is simply making us, as Henry Dimbleby says, sick. He says we need a food system that doesn't make the planet and the consumers sick. I don't think you can say it much more plainly than that. And then I just throw in the small problem of food waste, which I think we've been aware of for a long time. And there is, I think, at least now a purposeful agenda to try to address that. So there's the four challenges. We're in a climate emergency, a biodiversity emergency, a health and diet emergency. And I would add to that we've got some structural problems in the operation of the food chain. So what's the way out of this, and what are the policy strings we're going to have to pull to deal with all this? Well, I'll give you three perspectives on this, and I'm going to start with the climate one, because I think it's the one that is spelled out in most, this is spelled out for the UK. I haven't come across the comparable analysis for the EU, but that's almost certainly because I haven't looked hard enough, although maybe it doesn't exist. The Committee on Climate Change in the UK has done a lot of work on this for the last 2 or 3 years, and in preparation for the fact that our government is now committed to net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050, just as the EU has. And they pointed out very clearly that to deal with that, the agriculture and land use change and forestry sectors must be considered together. And the next point is that they acknowledge that agricultural emissions cannot reach zero by 2050. I would add, they can't reach zero ad infinitum. I think you can't produce agricultural crops and livestock without some greenhouse gas emissions. Therefore, in order to get to net zero, one of land uses functions in future must be to release land for carbon sequestration in biomass and soils, especially peat management, which certainly has relevance in Ireland. And the Climate Committee say there's 5 actions here. We have to reduce agricultural emissions however we can, and that's a long story, but we know what the elements of that are. I'll say no more about that. Second, we have to increase afforestation in Britain. I've no idea how much additional forestation is justified in other member states, although I do note that even in Sweden, where they've done a lot of work on the land contribution to net zero, they acknowledge that even in Sweden, with the amount of forest cover they already have, they still talk about another 14% increase in forest area. So if they require it, then I would guess most EU states probably need this. Third is peatland rewetting. We've either got peatland and it's been drained and it needs rewetting, or you haven't. And if you have, it needs rewetting. both upland peat and lowland peat. And the lowland peat is a problem, of course, because where it exists and where it's been drained, it often provides some of the most fertile soils in Europe. It certainly does in Britain. So there's a challenge there. Their fourth element is that they are in favor of a significant increase in bioenergy crops, by which they mean perennial crops, short rotation forest, miscanthus, for bioenergy production with carbon capture and storage. And of course, we haven't actually got that yet, but they're saying that should play a contribution in the next 30 years. And their fifth point is they say you can't put that lot together, particularly reducing the agricultural area and not drag in more imports, which they say they don't want to do, and feed the additional 13% of population in the UK, which is true in some other member states, although many or EU states are losing population rather than gaining it. But in order to square the circle, they're saying we need to reduce consumption of carbon-intensive foods, and they point to beef and dairy. And without doing that, they can't balance. Now, we're talking fairly substantial changes here, 20% loss of agricultural area, 20% reductions in consumption, which incidentally, compared to some other groups like Lancet, is quite small. And there's many policy actions suggested to bring this about, including regulation, including public and private funds. Come on to more of this later. And then both government and food industry actions on consumption. They also recognise we may need carbon border taxes because countries won't go about this at the same rate, and there's no point in exporting emissions. That's the first perspective. And as I say, in my view, it's most clearly worked out in terms of the scale of the sort of changes that have to be brought about. The second view, which comes out of all of those other studies without exception, and from almost everybody who you talk about who says the food system's broken, you say, how is it broken? And the constant diagnosis is we've over-intensified land use causing environmental damage. And I don't deny that for a second. And that was the phrase that Frank used. And so therefore, if you think that the cause of the problem is intensification, then it's not surprising that the remedy is to de-intensify. And I notice that almost nobody uses that phrase. They're scared to, I think. What is intensity? It's always a ratio. It's a ratio of inputs per hectare. People always immediately focus on nutrients per hectare, nitrogen especially, and phosphorus. PPPs, plant protection products, otherwise known as pesticides, perhaps machinery, there's been compaction of the soil and so on. I would point out that a good deal of the intensification is knowledge intensification. I'll come back to that. And the point about input intensity, it was done for a purpose in order to increase the output intensity, in other words, the yields of crops and animals, in order to better utilize our scarcest resource, we thought, land. But also, of course, intensity is more than just fertilizers and pesticides. It's the change in farming systems, generally speaking, their simplification, specialization, and scale, which has removed a lot of features of the landscape and habitat in the process. And it's the combination of that series of changes which has brought about the environmental damage that we now observe. So the proposals, not surprisingly, are to de-intensify, and that's what the Green Deal is making very clear with its strategies that have been so far published, the Farm to Fork and Biodiversity strategies. And it's got several elements. It's talking about restrictions and regulations on input use, on fertilizers, on pesticides, on antibiotics. It talks about, I would expect to see there'll be discussion about permitted practices, application limits. There's certainly discussion about the approval process for pesticides. Europe already has a very stringent set of regulations. There are proposals to make it more stringent. There are others. Helm, in the book that I referenced, is very strong on pollution taxes. And there's one or two member states in the EU who use that, notably the Danes, on pesticides, and it has some impact. And the second thing is that in de-intensification is to induce change in system. And this is where the language starts to get a bit fuzzy and a bit floppy in my view. So we all talk about switching to sustainable farming systems without being very concrete about what is a sustainable farming system and how do you measure it. But what it essentially means in the Green Deal is more organic farming or a switch to agroecology, agroforestry, and so on, which have those features of using less of those variable inputs, fertilizers and pesticides. That's the second perspective. The third perspective, in a sense, tends to emerge from the traditional conventional farming organizations and to some extent from the industry, particularly the upstream industry, is what I'm calling here techno-optimism. And it's saying that this is the way we've dealt with our problems in the past, is we turn to technology. And there's no doubt whatsoever, there's a stream of farm technologies, plus genetics, plus novel production systems, which undoubtedly are out there, can improve the efficiency of agricultural production. Those who are nervous about this say, well, this is the approach that got us into the mess we're in. How can it be that doing more of the same will bring about a different result? Well, the answer is essentially a lot hinges on the extent to which you believe precision can significantly reduce the inputs that we're pouring onto land so that a significantly lower fraction of them enters the environment, the atmosphere, water, and so on, and in a sense causes collateral damage. And then to what extent can we build in disease resistance and obviate the need for these? I mean, if we could get nitrogen fixing into arable crops, reduce significantly the need for artificial for mineral fertilizer, but that's been on the books for quite a while. And I'm not going to go into, but novel production systems will undoubtedly occur and undoubtedly will make a contribution in some areas, but not to big acre agriculture, either to arable farming systems or to the extensive grazing systems. They're in a sense, those novel production systems, vertical farming, is the epitome of factory farming. It's literally locating production in factories near consumers. So pulling this together, it's the environmental and economic sustainability, in my view, that defines that our food system is not secure. Farmers constantly want to talk about food security. The trouble is the next sentence is nearly always self-sufficiency or the degree of self-supply. And I think this has got nothing to do with self-supply. The reason that we're not food secure is because we can't guarantee this present system can operate indefinitely because it's contributing to climate change, which itself is damaging our production capacity. So to rise to the four challenges, it's very clear we have to have a food system plus rural land management approach. And that's part of the problem, is that there's one group of people who want to focus on the food system, another group who want to focus on land management, and they don't always talk the same. And there's a very clear message that we can't rise to these challenges in agriculture alone. We have to operate on the consumption side of food markets as well as the production side. And the consumption issues are mostly for citizens, the food industry and government, not farmers. Farmers have got very little influence there. They've got some, but farmers' job is to respond to the market. If through concerted effort and people simply becoming aware, if, as is already evident in the trends in red meat consumption, people eat less as time goes on and more fruit, nuts and pulses, then it's farmers' jobs to follow those market developments and supply them. And they say they're market oriented, that they can continue in that vein. Sorry, the thing keeps jumping on its own. The land use and climate action requires a systematic reallocation of agricultural land for carbon sequestration and for biodiversity protection. I mean, in Britain, we talk about more space for nature, better managed and more joined up. And that requires, in a sense, reallocation of land. And it's finding the balance of these things, which then starts to be quite tricky. Do we know enough about the feasibility of simultaneously feeding Europe affordably in the context of growing world population, although not in Europe by and large, in some countries, but not all and not most, while reducing the agricultural area in order to make way for more forest and peat restoration, and de-intensifying at least part of broadacre farming. Incidentally, if you're going to reduce pesticides and fertilizers, it'll be in the arable areas where you have to do that, because that's where 3/4 of them are used. the horticulture is an intensive user of those, but only occupies a very small fraction of the area. And it may be that we're de-intensifying some parts of agriculture whilst intensifying other parts in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and to restore biodiversity, and at the same time not dragging in more imports and therefore exporting our pollution and greenhouse gases. Do we know the balance to bring that about? I don't think we do. I don't just think we don't know that. We jolly well don't know it, because there's very little research effort to explore these interactions. And to my mind, the two of the critical implications, which are completely missing from the Green Deal and the strategies that have come out so far, and I think that's pretty serious, is what happens to food prices in this transformation? Because we're talking about a transformation of the way we use land and produce our food. Now, there's one set of logic that's very clear. The reason we've got this problem is that agriculture is causing these environmental externalities, and so the task in hand is to internalize them. And part of that can quite intelligently be both to signal to the farmers the real costs of some of these inputs that they're using with very high leakage, the fertilizers and pesticides and so on, and also to make it clear to consumers the impacts of their consumption. And so that says, well, raise the price. And there's no doubt that if you reduce the intensity of production of agricultural land, as organic farmers choose to do, the way that they make their business stack up and viable is they get an organic premium. In Europe, they also get handouts and additional handouts and favours from the CAP, but let's park them for the moment. All farmers are getting some handouts in Europe. But the point is that can you make that system at the farm level with lower yields economically attractive without higher producer prices, without higher product prices? And the problem is that if we drive food prices up, we already have a problem of food poverty in Europe. It's become more evident in the COVID crisis because poorest people have lost most from the economic measures we've taken to contain the public health crisis, and food poverty is on the rise in most countries. This is a serious welfare issue. And whilst we say, well, we'll have to accompany the food policy with a change in welfare policy, that's absolutely right, we will. But being credible about that is seriously difficult, not least because the food policy will be an EU construct and the social policy will be a member state construct. So this is not simple stuff. And the other critical issue is if Europe is going down the track of significantly raising its environmental standards to protect the environment, to protect the climate, to protect biodiversity, and is prepared, as we used to in the first 35 years of the CAP, Europe was overtly and deliberately a high price zone internationally. We then brought our prices down to international levels during the reforms of the McSharry and Fischler reforms in the 90s and the first part of this century, and we're much closer to world markets. We could choose to go back to where we're then protecting our domestic market because it's higher cost, because we're imposing higher environmental and animal welfare standards. And how do we then face up to the international trade consequences of that and still secure free trade agreements for the bulk of the things we export, which are not agricultural products, but services, financial, creative services and manufacturers and so on. That's a very real issue. And again, it's not considered in the current strategies. So what I'm saying is, can we simultaneously reduce agricultural area and reduce the intensity of agricultural land, and balance that by reduced consumption? And how do we go about it? The prevailing view amongst farming organisations seems to be, yes, we're happy to rise to this challenge with a twin track approach. We'll use the CAP to pay farmers for public goods, to provide the environmental services that we want from them, and and then we'll have a significant knowledge intensification to intensify on the remaining agricultural area to balance the system, they say. Others, and not just NGOs, because quite a few of the people I've quoted are certainly not NGOs, they're not environmental NGOs, say that's insufficient. That combination, that dual track approach is probably, those are probably both useful contributors, but they're not sufficient. We need a system transformation, because the first of those two strategies pays no attention to overconsumption and waste. You don't hear farmers talking about that very much, because it means lower markets for their output. And they pay insufficient attention to climate stability and biodiversity, and they tend to be over-optimistic about technology. Whereas on the other hand, my criticism of those who are arguing for the system transformation in the shape of de-intensification is, yes, of course, we've got to de-intensify in some parts of agriculture, but they pay far too little attention to economic and technical feasibility. I mean, look at that 10 years for agroecology study in France. It's an excellent study about the technical possibilities, but there's nothing in there about the on-farm economics and the market economics of bringing that about, and what happens to food prices in the process. They simply say it's technically possible to feed Europe agroecologically, and I don't doubt that. I think they're probably correct in that. Assuming, as they do, there's a substantial adjustment in consumption. So my instincts are that we're going to need contributions from each of these approaches. The question is, how on earth do we find them and balance them? So last couple of minutes, what policies do we need to push this debate further forward? I mean, it's out there, and the Green Deal is a very overt recognition of this debate, and I think the Green Deal is a very brave set of statements. I was amazed that the Commission produced that as its first big policy statement when it took office the end of last year. The trouble is, it's been completely swamped by the COVID crisis, as everything is, but all these issues haven't gone away. The first step, and in my view, the most important step in this, is we still, to my mind, don't have sufficient high-level political and public agreement on the direction of travel. The Green Deal is important, but I don't think, for the reasons I've said, because it's silent on prices and trade, that it's sufficient on this. And it's very clear that whilst at the highest level in the European Council, the Green Deal is accepted, when you come to the sectoral measures, you'll see that the Farming Council, the Agriculture Council, certainly don't accept it. And the backtracking, particularly on the farm, on elements of the farm to fork strategies, and they're not engaging in a positive, constructive way yet. So that's the first task, is to work more at that level, because without that, we're going nowhere. And incidentally, I'll say at this point, in my view, if we don't agree that the climate crisis is the #1 environmental priority of our time, and we have to address it, then we won't get sufficiently sharp focus of debate and then follow-up action. We'll just be talking about this for the next 30 years. So that's the first thing, is high-level political and public agreement. The next is, and the way that comes about is by discussion and argument. The next is that we must, in that process, agree this is a matter of food system, not just farming, and it must involve behaviour change in consumers and food chain, and it's also a question of land use as between agriculture, forestry, wildlife, and settlements. That the means for bringing about that land use change will obviously be implemented at member state level, but it's an unavoidable part of the rebalancing we're talking about. And my next point is, I would definitely start next with consumption, because if we can't make progress on this, we won't make space to make the changes on the production side. All the while people are demanding and not changing their consumption patterns, farmers will simply say it's our job just to feed people, not to tell them what to eat. Well, we do have to tell people what to eat because they're eating very badly, and it's hurting both the environment and the health services and the cost of the health services. So this is education, health messaging, and establishing the social acceptability of the changes. And I think we've gone a very long way on this already, in the way that red meat consumption is a live discussion issue, an action issue out there across Europe. Public procurement will, of course, or should play a very important part in this, in schools and hospitals and throughout the whole public sector. And then the third thing in my list is this will not happen without pressure on the food chain. They can and will and should do some of it for their own sustainability purposes, and the big companies do take sustainability strategies seriously, but those who don't will have to be pushed. And this will be to do with ingredient sourcing. They'll have to be much more open about that and provide the traceability and labeling so that consumers can see where and how their foods have come from in order to make informed choices. And there will almost certainly have to be more pressure via regulation and taxes on changing the balance of sugar, fat, salt content, portion sizes, and so on. I think we have to be more active in that. And the other issue is always that fair pricing and returns in the food chain. So my argument is start there, because if you don't start there, you're not moving in the direction that's required, both on health grounds and environmental grounds. And because if you do start there and it becomes clearer each year that goes by that consumption patterns really are changing, then farmers, in a sense, can be convinced by that message, and it will give them the confidence to see how and in what direction they have to change. Then the next thing I would say is incentivize the land use change. Nobody's going to go out there and plant trees on a big scale on agricultural land because the returns are too slow and too distant. It makes no economic sense, and they devalue the value of the land. It won't happen unless and until we find a way to incentivize it. And some of that can be through certification of carbon stored and carbon trading, but there's some significant steps that have to be met before we can do that at scale. There can be some public payment for carbon. There certainly can be payment for biodiversity. That's what you've been talking about for the last 2 days. And payment for other benefits, flood mitigation and so on. Some of this will come about through regulation, by requirements on certain groups of land owners and managers. They have to do certain things or not do certain things, like burning peat or draining peat. And others can come about through private financing. There's a lot of talk in Britain, and I know there are schemes about this in Germany, for getting net gain from developments to pay for biodiversity management wherever biodiversity is diminished by building on it for whatever purposes. And that could be a significant source of funds and stimulus for a different management of land. But the key thing is to get action soon. And my worry is that we'll be so precious about the details of permanence, additionality and liability that we wait until we solve those problems before we set the schemes up, and another 5 or 10 years goes down the road and the trees aren't planted and the peat isn't re-wetted, and we'll be nowhere on track towards net zero 2050. If you don't get those trees in the ground soon, start doing it at scale soon, it'll be too late to achieve the targets that we're confronting. So get meaningful action on the consumption side and the land change, and then it seems to me that the view of farmers will be different. Now, I can give you the other ingredient in the UK that where I think the penny's dropping amongst farmers is that our farmers have been told that by 2028 your basic payments cease. So if you're therefore not listening to these other possibilities to use your land for carbon sequestration, then in certain areas, particularly the uplands, you're going to be struggling financially. You're struggling financially already, even with the cap payments. So I think that the combination of meaningful action on consumption and incentivizing land use change really can bring about a different attitude amongst land managers, and that's absolutely necessary. And so that then brings us to where I started this talk. It's the dear old cap. Well, we've got the cap we've got. The council has agreed this week. The Parliament's agreed. They'll now enter the trialogue. And we more or less know the kind of cap reforms that we're stuck with for the next period until 2028. In my view, it's hopelessly inadequate. The tinkering. I think it's interesting to devolve more responsibility to member states. We'll see what comes out of that. My prediction is what comes out of that will be a watering down of environmental requirements, not a stiffening in most countries. And so the key thing is to be thinking about the next reform so that the next commission who come in the end of 2024 can steer the post-28 food and land policy, which is going to have to succeed the cap. And it'll be clear by mid-decade whether the current model is any better for the environment. Now, I can hear you all saying, look, it's far too soon to be talking about cap reform. We're still in the throes of implementing what dear old Commissioner Hogan set rolling. But I'm afraid I've spent my life talking about this, so I can't stop myself. So here's my final points. We will still need a common policy for land management, whether it's an agricultural policy or something wider we can discuss. Why? Because we still have a single market in Europe. The trans-border issues of water, biodiversity are too important. We can't have 28 policies on these things. And also for solidarity purposes, because this will still have to be a substantial policy, marshalling substantial funds to bring about these changes. And therefore it makes sense to do it with a common European budget. However, the two pillars have done their bit as far as I'm concerned. We've had them now for 20 years. We'll have them for another until 2028. We've completely confused what their objectives are, which measures are in which pillar and why, and the funds. It's a complete mess. It's not serving a useful purpose. It's becoming an obstacle to progress. What's going on? Sorry. So we've got to recognise it has to become a wider policy for rural land management. And I do think that we won't get these changes without making some adjustments to the governance structures and processes. If you ask farm ministers to agree on agricultural policy, you won't get a wider land management policy necessary for biodiversity and climate, which is what this has got to be a substantial part of. It's too sectorally defined. And so my last word is to the researchers amongst you, that the economic implications of the shifts that we're talking about, attracting land out of farming, shifting consumption for basic foods, de-intensifying land management over substantial areas, are seriously under-researched as an integrated set of measures, and particularly the food price issue and the credible policies to deal with that, and the trade issues. And it does seem to me that farmers who are complaining that they need an impact assessment of all these changes, I think they've got some reason. I mean, I've got some sympathy for that argument, but although I think they've defined the problems too narrowly. But I think that will be, doing that work will be part of making the case for the kind of system transformation that I think we have to be thinking about. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks very much, Alan. That's fantastic. I might get you to stop sharing your screen there, Alan, if you don't mind. And we have a bit of time for discussion. There's some really interesting questions coming in on chat and conversations on chat, Alan. So I think you've stimulated a good debate already. I'm going to give you a bit of a breather for a couple of minutes by inviting a fellow agricultural economist from Ireland, Tom Arnold. Tom chairs the Agri-Food Strategy for Ireland 2030. He's got a lot of experience, I think, in agriculture, economics, rural development, and so on across the world. And he's somebody who commands a lot of respect here in Ireland. So maybe, Tom, if we can invite you to say a few words in response to that excellent presentation from Alan.
Well, thank you, Brendan. Thank you, Brendan. Can you?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear, Tom.
Fine, okay. Well, it's a particular pleasure to follow Alan Bookwell. We worked together a mere 45 years ago in the European Commission, in the old DG6, DG Agriculture. And I think, and Alan at that stage went off back to his academic career. which I've been following with admiration in the interim 45 years, but we've never met. So this is a lovely occasion to reconnect with Alan. I think what he's given us today is a masterly analysis of a very complex, evolving situation. I think he's asking all the right questions, and he's posing at the end of his presentation some really big dilemmas and choices that are going to have to be made, both at European level and indeed within Ireland. We're going to have to make our version of those choices as well. And we're going to make those, Brendan, in the 2030 strategy. To our great good fortune, Brendan is a member of the 2030 Strategy Committee. And we've done a lot of work, but we still have a lot of work to do and get towards a final report. And in that final report, we're going to have to confront some of those issues that Alan spelled out so very clearly. Now, I'd like to comment as well on what I heard in the first half of the first part of the afternoon. And I'm struck by a couple of comments made by both Timothy from the United States and Frank from the European Commission, who talked about the community of practice that we have actually in full evidence in this afternoon and yesterday, which I missed, but in this whole Winterage program. And it is fair to say, as they both said, that what you have managed to do over the last number of years is assemble a community of practice in Ireland, which is both Europe leading and perhaps has relevance for the wider world. And okay, so this session, these 2 days are hugely relevant in terms of both timeliness and relevance. Timely because I think some of the thinking that is on evidence in this Winterage program will have to find its way into our 2030 strategy, which hopefully will influence Irish policy over the next decade. And it will also inevitably find its way, I think, into the CAP strategic plans that will be part of our lives from 2022 onwards. I just try to pick out, maybe make 3 points, which I think I've drawn from the conversation, particularly in the first part of the session of the afternoon, and I put them under, I would say, 3 headings, and titled them principles which are relevant to the farmer, practicality which are relevant to the policymaker, and I would say performance which is relevant to both farmer and policymaker. If we start with principles, I think there's a very basic issue as to how, in terms of the type of schemes we're talking about, how do we ensure that farmers can fully commit to such schemes, commit to them and deliver on them? How can we make sure that we see farmers as the solution to these problems rather than the problem itself? And it seems to me that in terms of answering that question, John Finn in his contribution gave a lot of the answers, but I'd like to just pick out 3 or 4 things that I think are of particular importance. And the first one is the capacity to listen and learn from the experience of people. The very first time I met Brendan was it's probably nearly 20 years ago, when I was taken on a walk in the Burren with my dear friends, Marcus McInerney, sadly no longer with us, and Michael McGrath. And it was at an early stage of the work there. What was very evident, even at that stage, was Brendan's capacity to listen and learn from the people he was working with. And that, I think, is a critically important issue. The second issue is fostering local leadership to move agendas along. And I think some of the local leaders, excellent local leaders in the Burren, are on this call. And that the connection between local leadership and connecting into communities to achieve change is of critical importance. The type of pride of place that Corina spoke so well about in the early part of the afternoon is also relevant. And then celebrating success And that's where something like the Farming for Nature scheme comes into play. All of these things have operated and applied in the Burren, but I think they have a much wider relevance and should be taken into account as we look to see how a more Farming for Nature approach can be integrated into national and European policy. The second issue is practicality, and here we're talking about what's relevant for the policymaker and for government. I think there's a very important insight that was made, the connection between acknowledging the complexity of what we're dealing with and yet having the simplicity of interface in dealing with the farmer. Ensuring that the farmer client who's going to engage in this, it's made easier for them to comply with what the direction of policy is trying to do. The notion of predictable government behavior, easy to understand rules, and then coming to this critical issue of scaling up. How can we take what is now at this stage a significant number of pilot projects around Ireland, and how can we get them into a wider scale? And Frank raised the intriguing question that perhaps there is that we can apply some of those even at European level. And finally, the issue of performance. I mean, ultimately, if we are going to achieve change in this direction, it's going to have to be a combination of farmers adopting and government facilitating that adoption. And last evening, when James Rebanks was talking so very persuasively, Brendan made the point that there has to be an element of, I quote, pocket, head, and heart. That seems to me to be a profoundly important insight, and that leads us into the issue of the incentive structures to get results and how you can have adaptive improvements. And John Finn spoke about that as well. The notion that you'd have hybrid and blended approaches to achieving results and performance, and the whole notion of finding a way of supporting ecosystem service provision and paying for it all seem to me to be entirely relevant. So congratulations on, I think, a splendid session yesterday and today, and I'm looking forward to the rest of it before tomorrow evening. Brendan, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks very much, Tom. That was a fine response, and it linked together so many different dimensions of what we're doing, I think, across Europe as a network, the RBP network, and also what we're trying to do as part of this particular conference. And I think what's really interesting as well, it brought together two sessions this afternoon, because I think Alan spoke of the huge challenges that we face at a policy level, but I always worry that at a ground level, really, we still depend on farmers to either produce the food or the environmental services. So how do we translate policy into practice? It's a really challenging one. And I think result-based payments, as discussed in the first section, have a big role to play in that regard. As I said, there's a bunch of questions for Alan. I don't even know where to start, so I'll start with an easy one, Alan, from Catherine Murray. One big broad question. We're all interested in improving things. We critique the systems, be they agricultural, economic, social ecosystems, in an effort to improve things, to make things better. But in the context of Britain leaving the EU, do you think it's easier to overhaul the whole system, as the UK is essentially doing, or tweak the system? So I guess what Catherine's saying is, do you think this Brexit experiment, or whatever you might like to call it, creates an opportunity to shape that radical policy change that you outlined?
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Whether we grasp that opportunity or not remains to be seen. But sorry, I'm just going to switch that on. But my point is that the same challenges that confront the European Union, and in my view, there's no distinction to be made about the changes that both require. Of course, you've got to, I've just been flicking through the questions. You've got to start somewhere. And what I'm saying is that there already is a CAP reform. There already is a Green Deal and those strategies, and the Commission is determined and will come forward with a host of new proposals and measures to give effect to some of those, and they are mostly things that are moving in one or other of the directions that we pointed to. And my argument is there isn't a single movement for all farms in all European countries to travel in. The story would be very different in extensive grazing systems in Ireland compared to intensive livestock in the Netherlands and so on. So there will be some further intensification of some systems, but there will, I think the big question is the extent to which we really are prepared to grasp a reduction in the intensity of broad scale agriculture, which is the one that's using most of the offending inputs that people are concerned about, which is overuse of nutrients and as non-farmers see it, overuse of crop protection chemicals, and what measures we use now. Those measures are going to take place anyway, and this is why I'm saying, therefore, the priority now in grasping the scale of the challenge, that there's no point in talking about climate and biodiversity emergencies and saying it's just full speed ahead with the current agenda, and let's I take my hat off to the work that you guys are doing on the very specific questions of how to make public payment for public goods, ecosystem services, how to make it work for the farmer and to deliver noticeable environmental benefit. That is a vitally important part of all this, but it's only a part. That's my point. And so that's why I'm saying that's the next stages of this, where we require big picture pronouncements and then actions to follow, and concerted actions are on consumption and on incentivizing land use change. There's a question that's out there that I can see, and I'm very conscious of this when I come to Ireland or I talk to an Irish audience, where you've got a big dependence on the cattle industry for dairy and beef. This is absolutely understandable. But to be frank, and I'm very happy for people to just tell me I'm wrong, it will not cut the mustard saying that pastures are a great storage of carbon. Yes, of course they are. But managing your pastures is not going to create any additionality. If you're already managing them well and they're not peat and they haven't been drained and they're not emitting, then managing them well will manage them well. Well done. And you're not putting too much nitrogen on, there's not too much leakage into the river. That's not going to add anything to carbon sequestration. The only way you'll get carbon sequestration is you've got to change land use. And you've got to change it, and the two or three main ways are the ones that I've summarized. It's afforestation, because over a long period you will store more carbon in the forestry. Of course, it matters enormously what the fate of the forest is. That's not a trivial concern, but you'll soak up a lot more carbon in forest. I mean, because the science is out there showing it. And we've got a long way to go to produce the factors, the sequestration and emission factors, site by site, climate by climate, species by species, management system by management system. And I don't minimize at all the complicated questions about where's this afforestation going to take place. I mean, I would say start by just offering money to increase the forest area and see who bids. And then, in a sense, there's a fantastic challenge of using some of those lessons that Tom was talking about getting communities of interest to agree on where they want the forestry and how it should be managed to provide both biodiversity as well as carbon. So that there's huge questions there, but make a start by saying we're going to make a push in this direction is my argument.
Thank you very much, Alan. Very thought-provoking again. I guess maybe just one simple response to that, or simplistic response, if you like, would be around this notion of co-benefits that, sometimes it's about biodiversity and carbon, or carbon and biodiversity, or food production. It's about getting the most from any particular area of land. And I think even with forestry, it's quite a complex term because there's ways of integrating forestry with food production. So I guess there's a whole spectrum of approaches. Just one particular point as well to draw people's attention to. There's a discussion there about livestock and the role of cattle and so on. I think there's a very interesting report that you authored yourself on behalf of the Rise Foundation about the safe operating space for livestock in Europe. Yep. So I think that's a report well worth looking at for those in the audience today. I'm afraid we're running out of time, Alan, unless you have any last word.
No, I think.
Well,
You've given me a fantastic opportunity to give my word. So thank you for giving me that time and attention.
Yeah, so listen, thanks so much, Alan. I know you put a lot of work into preparing that bespoke presentation for us this afternoon, and it's really interesting for us to get the big picture, and likewise Tom with your response, which kind of pulled a lot of different dimensions together. For all the speakers this morning, I think the work that's been done across Europe, the RBPS network and others is phenomenal. I think there's a great community of change emerging. It's a part of the solution, as Alan said, it's not, there's a lot more that needs to happen. But it's important that we focus on what we're doing and do it as well as we possibly can. So I'd like to thank all the speakers, the chairs, most especially my colleague Tim O'Connell in the next room, who's been coordinating this Zoom nightmare with different rooms and so on and so forth. So well done, Tim. And I'd just like to say there's a fantastic, very thought-provoking speaker as well tonight, Rob Burton. And I think it goes back to the point that Tom made about, you know, the identity of the farmer and engaging the farmer, and you know, this frame change that, you know, the farmer is no longer just a food producer. He's much more, he or she is much more than that. They're going to be part of the solution to a lot of these challenges that we face. But how do you engage with the farmer? It's a really interesting topic as well. So please join if you can at 8 p.m. tonight. You can have a few hours off in between. And please join us as well tomorrow. We have some really good international case studies. So thanks to everybody, and we hope to see you later this evening or tomorrow. Good evening.